Hello, my name's Matt Sergio. I run the websites The Occult Beatles and also Conspiromedia, which is a site that looks into the conspiratorial and occult aspects, whether alleged or not, of the 1960s music scene in London, especially during the so-called counterculture era, that era during the later part of the 60s, from around mid to late 1966 onwards, when LSD made it onto the scene and the music and fashions went psychedelic accordingly, when so-called hippies began to flower. As I'm recording this now, it's March 2023. And a year or so back, I went on a short visit to London, which is about 3 hours away from where I live. I went to London for a short 3-day visit, a city break. And when I was booking the hotel, when I was looking online to find a suitable hotel to stay at for this visit, I came upon one hotel in particular that took my fancy. And I then gradually began to realise that the area of London I picked, where this hotel is situated, is in Bloomsbury. Now, I hadn't picked to book this hotel for that reason. I didn't pick it because it's in Bloomsbury. But on noticing that it was in Bloomsbury, well, this made me all the more keen to get down to London, because Bloomsbury, as you might indeed be aware, was where in the first half of the 20th century, predominantly, a small group of what's been described as free thinkers lived and worked. Illustrious, notorious, some might say, free thinkers. This is Bloomsbury was a place where these free thinkers, this group of free thinkers, lived and worked, including such well-known names as the novelist Woolf. And this group have come to be known as the Bloomsbury Group. And I'd suggest that the group's free thinking ways were a precursor, a dry run, if you like, to the so-called counterculture of the 1960s. What was to happen in London just a few decades later? What was to happen in London just a few decades on from when this group was around predominantly? But aside from this group, there's more to this area of London that might interest you, much, much more. And this is something I came to realise increasingly once I got down to London for this 3-day city break. And once I got down there, and I came to realise this increasingly once I got down there and actually had a closer look. I had a bit of a walk about the streets around Bloomsbury and took in some of the streets and buildings and addresses. And I promised myself, after doing that I'd return to this area in the not too distant future, so that I could collect some spare time together to produce a video about it. And that's what I've done, and that's why I'm talking to you here. I returned to London and the same hotel in Bloomsbury after this short 3-day city break. I returned to London and the same hotel in Bloomsbury in January of 2023 to get some of those street locations and buildings onto video for you to watch here. Because if you're looking for possible evidence that the 1960s music scene in Britain was a social engineered project, then Bloomsbury's a good place to shine a spotlight on, I'd suggest. As you're probably very aware, there's a number of authors and researchers who for a number of years have opined, if not downright claimed, that the 1960s counterculture scene, or to give it its more preferred name by some who were there at the time, the underground scene, it's been opined, if not downright claimed, that the 1960s counterculture scene, or the underground scene, wasn't some organic culture. It was moulded this way, actually, in order to bring about a change in the consciousness of the youth of society of that time. For example, in order to promote so-called free love, and with it, the end of commitment to one partner, and eventually, as a result, the traditional family unit. It's also been accused that this alleged social engineering project of the 1960s is said to have been brought about also in order to addle the brains of the younger generation of that time, to addle their brains with drugs so that they couldn't be an effective voice of protest against their governments, whether it be against the war in Vietnam or for their own civil rights. As I say, the London area of Bloomsbury is of interest to me for these reasons. For starters, it's where you can find roots of what would become the notorious Tavistock Institute, because it was in Bloomsbury in 1920 that the Tavistock Clinic began, and from which the Tavistock Institute grew from in later years. And so you could say, perhaps, that the social engineering and tampering of 60s youth culture has its origins in Bloomsbury. But there's much more to this London area. Now, what I did in January of 23, when I returned to London to take some video footage of the Bloomsbury area, what I did was walk around this area with my video phone, and I took some shots of some of the streets and buildings that I think might be of interest to you with regards to social engineering. In effect, what I put together, what you're about to see in this video, if you choose to continue watching, is in essence a street tour of some of those locations that you might say link into the social engineering of the 1960s. And really, if you look here at the radius of the area I cover in this street tour, the radius of this said social engineering hotspot, from where you might conclude a number of secret agendas, projects and operations were masterminded and or carried out that influenced and duped a generation of youngsters in the 1960s in Britain and beyond, well, it's not a very big radius at all, really, is it? Not at all. It's all short walking distance. You can see the distance here. So on this map, I was here, Montague Street. That's where my hotel was and where I began my walking street tour for you. Indeed, here's a video of one end of Montague Street, the street, as I say, where my hotel is situated.
So yeah, as I was saying earlier, Bloomsbury is where you can find roots of what would become the notorious Tavistock Institute, the British-born organisation accused of orchestrating the 1960s so-called underground movement, the so-called counterculture. And this is me walking towards the hotel on Montague Street, the hotel where I was staying. And on the subject of the Bloomsbury Group, and this is outside the hotel actually, and this is me now walking towards our first destination on this street tour of Bloomsbury. If you remember, a few minutes ago I put forward the suggestion that the free-thinking ways of the Bloomsbury Group, and indeed their sexual permissiveness as well, the Bloomsbury Group, within that group there was a lot of sexual permissiveness going on. If you recall, a few minutes ago I put forward the suggestion that their free-thinking ways was a precursor to the 1960s. Let's just throw in the sexual permissiveness into that as well, into that mix. So yeah, I put forward the suggestion a few minutes ago that their free-thinking, sexual permissive ways, if you like, were a precursor to what happened in the 1960s. And certainly I'm not the only person to put forward that suggestion. By no means. A number of authors, researchers and historians, people who've actually dedicated a lot of time and a lot of their life into the research of the Bloomsbury Group, something that I haven't done. I've just barely touched the sides. Many of these commentators and historians and authors have put forward the same suggestion, that the Bloomsbury Group, their free-thinking ways, their sexual permissiveness, was a precursor to the 1960s. But I've got the impression that when these authors and researchers and historians have put forward this suggestion, is that when they're putting forward this suggestion, or when they've put forward this suggestion, and here we are at the end of Montague Street, when they put forward this suggestion, they're very much saying that it was an accident, that the way that the Bloomsbury Group lived in the first half of the 20th century, and then how the 1960s scene developed with its sexual permissiveness and its free-thinking ways, was accidental. Yes, the Bloomsbury Group was a precursor to what happened in the 60s, but it was an accident. It was by no means a deliberate move by the Bloomsbury Group for it to happen that way in the 1960s. Now, I'm putting forward the idea in this video that what if that wasn't the case? What if it wasn't accidental? Especially when you look at the backgrounds of some of the people that were involved in the Bloomsbury Group. They have backgrounds to some nefarious organisations, including the Fabian Society, a social engineering organisation based in Great Britain, formed in the 1800s, and which has very much been accused by researchers in more recent years of having had a hand in engineering, in moulding this 60s counterculture era. So whilst on this street tour, I'll be mentioning a number of notorious organisations, in other words, think tanks and other places that connect to Bloomsbury, such as the Fabian Society and the Tavistock Institute, of course, and of course there's the 60s underground scene of London, a scene that also has its fair share of, in some way, shape or form, military intelligence and governmental connections. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Dave McGowan. He authored the book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops and the Dark Heart of the Hippie Dream. And basically, just to briefly summarise this book, if you've never read it, let me just explain briefly what it's about. Basically, it's looking at the counterculture scene, but not of the UK, but of the US, and how in the 1960s, even though there was no music scene in Laurel Canyon, this area in America, although there was absolutely no music scene there at all, there were no record companies there, there were no bars or clubs where bands were playing, where they could where unknown bands could, let's say for example, move to be discovered by record companies. There was no scene at all there, but for some reason these bands and well-known music artists that became like the flag wave bearers of the 1960s music scene moved to this place in LA, this place called Laurel Canyon. And Dave McGowan puts forward the argument in his book that this was basically a place where all these artists moved to in order to help in tandem with the military, with the US military and the government and the intelligence services, working in tandem with them to bring about the social engineering of the 1960s scene in order to destabilize the disaffected youth against protesting effectively against the Vietnam War, for example, and also to, as I mentioned earlier, to debase traditional family values through the promotion of free love and LSD and the liberal use of drugs. And Dave puts forward some examples of some of the backgrounds of some of these so-called rebels of the establishment, these music artists who were actually secretly not rebels at all, but were part of the establishment. And he puts forward some examples of that. For example, there's Jim Morrison, lead singer of The Doors, that his father was US Navy Rear Admiral George Stephen Morrison, the man who was pretty much responsible or very much central to the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident of 1964, this false flag incident that helped to start the escalation of the Vietnam War. In effect, this false flag incident, this Gulf of Tonkin incident that George Stephen Morrison, Jim Morrison's father, was involved with, gave the US government of the time, led by then US President Lyndon B. Johnson, the excuse to send troops over to Vietnam and for the escalation of that very unpopular war. Another name, another anti-establishment figure, a so-called anti-establishment figure of the US countercultural scene, and that's Frank Zappa. Apparently Frank Zappa's father, and I'm quoting here from Dave's book, Frank Zappa's father was a chemist who worked at the Edgewood Arsenal Chemical Warfare US Army facility. And as a result, as a youngster, Frank's parents and he lived nearby to it. And there's also David Crosby. And these are all artists that lived and worked in the Laurel Canyon area. David Crosby, who was a member of the Byrds, and then later on Crosby, Stills and Nash. Quoting here from Dave McGowan's book, Dave Crosby, his family tree, and I quote, includes a truly dizzying array of US senators and congressmen, state senators and assemblymen, governors, mayors, judges, Supreme Court justices, Revolutionary and Civil War generals, signers of the Declaration of Independence, and members of the Continental Congress. So, yeah, that's Dave McGowan writing about the US countercultural scene. And I've had a look at the UK counterculture scene and some of the movers and shakers within the London scene around the same time that was going on. Well, not around the same time, at exactly the same time in the 1960s. And yes, you can find equivalents of what was going on in the US with regards to family backgrounds and some of the movers and shakers of the 60s scene. You can find that in the UK as well, and I'll be mentioning some names as we go along. And this is a good time to mention the British philosopher Bertrand Russell, because he's absolutely relevant to this walk around the Bloomsbury area in London. As you might indeed know, he's credited as a founding member in 1958 of the UK-based organisation CND, otherwise known as the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, an organisation that's been credited with helping to water the seeds of what would, in the following decade, the 1960s, become that countercultural scene in Great Britain. And indeed, the CND logo, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament logo, has been adopted throughout the world. So if you've never heard of the CND, I'm sure you will be very familiar with the logo, because it's been adopted throughout the world. It was used during the 1960s as an emblem of the anti-Vietnam War protests. It's not known as a CND symbol anymore. It's known as a peace sign. And yes, it was used and continues to be used in anti-war protests, and it was certainly used during the 1960s by anti-Vietnam War protesters. And so, yeah, the CND, along with its unmistakable logo, was formed in 1958, just over a decade after the nuclear explosions over Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the onset of the so-called Cold War, and with it a so-called nuclear arms race, predominantly between the US and Russia, but also Britain. In Britain, the CND attracted thousands upon thousands of members in the late 1950s, thousands and thousands of card-carrying members in the late 1950s, early 1960s, all of whom, in its earliest years, took part in public, peaceful demonstrations that included sit-ins and marches across England, including the popular 52-mile protest marches every Easter from London to the atomic weapons research development in the village of Aldermaston. Reportedly, the 1958 and 59 marches attracted a total of 210,000 marchers combined. From what I've been led to understand, the CND's membership featured a whole cross-section of the UK's population from all walks of life and classes, including, to be more specific to this video, a significant number of what one might describe as bohemians and beatniks. In other words, people who chose to live on the fringes of popular mainstream culture. There was also, so it's been said, a monumentally large number of young people who participated. In other words, young men and women in their late teens. And apparently it was these youngsters, along with the beatniks and the bohemians, who first met each other and acknowledged each other at these CND demonstrations and marches. And then later, as a consequence, they became the hippies of the 60s counterculture. Also, there were those who actively got involved in CND in its early years who actually later on went on to become the key movers and shakers of that 60s underground movement, such as Peter Jenner. He'd been on those marches to Aldermaston. In later years, in 1966, he became co-manager of a then largely unknown band by the name of Pink Floyd, who, before finding national, then international fame, were effectively the de facto #1 leading house band for London's underground scene. Another acknowledged mover and shaker on the underground scene of 60s London, and who, so I'm led to understand, had initially been active within CND, was the English poet and writer Geoff Nuttall, who said of those CND marches, and I quote, "On the march, you got pacifists, you got Quakers in large numbers, conscientious objectors, mostly from the middle class, you got contingents from the trade unions, and you had beatniks who suddenly emerged, and nobody had known them outside their own favourite haunts, the Soho coffee bars and jazz clubs in London." Echoing Geoff Nuttall's perspective there in his own inimitable way, there's Mick Farren, a larger-than-life character on the underground scene of 60s London, partly thanks in his role as singer in another of the underground scene's bands in London in the 60s, the Deviants. He said, "The campaign for nuclear disarmament provided a catalyst for a lot of things. It was a completely broad spectrum of ideologies, from card-carrying Communist Party members to pacifists to Buddhists to kids looking to get laid. A large slice of kind of left liberal thinking people were suddenly thrown together. You know, there was a lot of fun and there was a lot of sex. Maybe you smoked your first pot, you know." Someone else, another key figure of the underground scene who says he was involved actively in the CND in its early years in those days, not long after it had been formed, is Barry Miles. In 1965, a few years later, after the formation of the CND in 1958, in 1965, he, along with John Dunbar, who was married to Marianne Faithfull for a time before she moved on to Mick Jagger, Barry Miles, along with John Dunbar, and Peter Asher, brother of English actress Jane Asher, who for most of the 60s was dating Paul McCartney, they opened the Indica, which was a bookstore and art gallery, very much a centre point location of the 60s countercultural scene in London. Remembering those CND marches in those early years, when he would have been a teenager, I guess, Miles isn't in much doubt that it helped to give rise to that counterculture movement. He says, "CND is what started the whole thing off, really. It was the first time that so many young kids, like myself, had ever left home. And then suddenly you were suddenly like sort of in a 4-day holiday camp, sleeping under tables in pubs and in church halls. And I mean, it was just amazing. And you met people from all over the country and met people who were like-minded. It was astonishing in that respect as a social movement. Sadly, it didn't end nuclear weapons, but as a social movement, it was fantastically important in, well, creating a sort of youth culture in this country, in the UK. There'd never been anything like that. So, yeah, basically thanks in large part to Bertrand Russell's efforts in the CND, he'd sown the seeds of what was to become the UK's counterculture of the 1960s. However, although he's admired by millions as a great thinker of his time, a great philosopher, a man to be lauded and admired, he's also garnered suspicions from other quarters as a man to be highly suspicious of, and I'll be looking a little bit more into that aspect of him as this street tour goes on. And actually, on the subject of Bertrand Russell, he's actually the first stop on this street tour. Here we are on a street in Bloomsbury where he once lived. This building here, in actual fact, with this blue plaque that you can see here commemorating Bertrand Russell, is one of the flats that he used to live at. And if you're wondering why there is the name Russell Chambers there on the building, if you're wondering if that has, if the name of this actual building has any connection to Bertrand Russell, then I don't know for sure, but I would say 99% certain that yes, there is a connection, and I'll be getting into the reason for that again a little bit later on. So, as I say, more about Bertrand Russell a bit later. Although, whilst on the subject of the CND, apparently another major figure of London's 1960s underground scene, who was a member of the CND in its early days in the early 1960s, was none other than John Hopkins, but best known as Hoppy, John Hoppy Hopkins. Incidentally, you might have noticed that I'm walking back from the direction I started this walking tour from. I'm walking back in that direction. In fact, I'm walking back to Montague Street. I'm going to walk down Montague Street, past the hotel where I was staying, and I'm going to carry on going along that direction in order to take us to our next destination on this street tour. So, yeah, John Hoppy Hopkins. He's actually lauded as the head figure of London's countercultural scene of 1960s London, its leading light, its main flag bearer. For example, between 1966 and 67, he was a founder of the International Times, otherwise known as IT. This was the UK's first ever underground newspaper for the underground. And he was the organiser as well of a weekly psychedelic nightclub event in London, spelt UFO but pronounced as UFO. One of the regular bands who played at UFO was the pre-fame Pink Floyd in the days when Syd Barrett was its lead member. Hoppy was also an organiser of the 1967 one-off event, the 14-hour Technicolor Dream. This was held at London's Alexandra Palace, at the Alexandra Palace venue in April of that year. It's been described as a multi-arts, multimedia and live concert event featuring poets, live performance art and dance, film shows and live music from the likes of countercultural favourites such as Pink Floyd, the band Soft Machine, also The Crazy World of Arthur Brown, and many more who played amidst the accompaniment of a psychedelic light show with strobe lighting. And some of those who attended, who milled around among the revellers at that event, included John Lennon. What you might find particularly interesting with regards to Hoppy, this hailed leader of London's counterculture movement, this anti-establishment figure, supposedly, what you might find particularly interesting with regards to Hoppy is his background, where he came from, and what he'd been up to prior to becoming the underground's de facto leader. If you remember, I mentioned just a few moments ago that I mentioned Dave McGowan and how he's looked at the US counterculture scene and seen all these connections with these so-called anti-establishment figures of that scene, of that countercultural scene. He's seen connections with those figures to military and intelligence and so-called elite families. If you remember, I mentioned earlier that I've noticed similar connections, very similar connections to Great Britain as well, and the movers and shakers of the 60s underground scene of London, and links of those movers and shakers to military intelligence and so on. And yeah, from what I understand, prior to 1960, the year that Hoppy joined the CND, and a few years before, of course, he became the hailed leader of the underground scene of London, a spokesperson of the anti-establishment, if you like. He was, get this, a nuclear physicist at the British government's Atomic Energy Research Establishment in the village of Harwell in the county of Oxfordshire. His father was a naval engineer as well, and Hoppy, born in 1937, went on to study at Cambridge University, one of England's and indeed one of the world's so-called top elite universities. And the students that are there, as you'll most probably be very aware, very often hailing from aristocratic, powerful and wealthy families and dynasties. It's a university that's been the launchpad of numerous future British prime ministers, as well as heads of state or government from other countries. It's also been the university of future kings and queens from around the world, including the UK. So yeah, this is where counterculture hero Hoppy, John Hoppy Hopkins, came from. And indeed, when you look at many of, as I said earlier, when you look at many of the more well-known active figures within the UK's countercultural scene, this scene that was out to promote rebellion against the status quo, so we're told, a large number of them actually hailed from Cambridge University. For example, as well as Hoppy, there was the earlier mentioned Peter Jenner, who was co-manager of Pink Floyd in their early days. He studied at Cambridge. And indeed, Syd Barrett's father worked at Cambridge University as well. And with regards to John Hoppy Hopkins and perhaps suspicious backgrounds, this is a photograph here of Hoppy circa 1954. So this would have been around the time he was about 17 years of age. And this is him in sergeant's uniform for the CCF. And what the CCF stands for is Combined Cadet Force. And it's very much in existence today. And according to its website, the CCF, the Combined Cadet Force, was formed in 1859. It was the idea of the then Secretary of State for War, Jonathan Peel, who wrote to public schools and universities at the time, inviting them to form units of the volunteer corps. Several schools took up the idea at the time, and the first cadet corps in a school was formed in 1860. And more soon followed. And these early units, according to the CCF's official website on its history page, these early units were focused on army activities and were usually associated with rifle volunteer battalions for home defence, with cadets wearing the uniforms of their parent volunteer battalions. These corps evolved over time, focusing on officer training, and during the First and Second World Wars, many of the young men who served in the units, this is according to the CCF's website, many of the young men who served in the units during the First and Second World Wars went on to serve their country in the armed forces. And after World War II, the structure of the armed forces changed, including the cadet units in school, which became the Combined Cadet Force in 1948, incorporating sections from all of the armed forces, the Royal Navy, Royal Marines, Army and Royal Air Force. Over the following decades, the focus of the group moved away from being a recruitment pathway into the armed forces, and the number of CCFs in state schools slowly grew, and they continue to this day. So, as I say, there's John Hoppy Hopkins in his sergeant's uniform for the CCF circa 1954. After leaving Cambridge and going on to work at Harwell as a nuclear scientist, rather bizarre this, I don't know what you think about this, he went on a holiday with some friends to, of all places, and this is during the height of the so-called Cold War, he went on a holiday with some friends in a 1936 funeral hearse. He travelled there in a 1936 funeral hearse. He went to, of all places, Russia, to attend a communist youth festival, so it's claimed. And apparently on his return to Britain, given the nature of his job, given that he was working as a scientist in a government nuclear facility, who then decided to go to a communist youth festival in Russia, in communist Russia. On his return to Britain, given the nature of his job and where he just come from, he was, as a result, quote unquote, debriefed by the British intelligence services, who then, so it's claimed, so Barry Miles, who was Hoppy's friend, and others close to Hoppy have claimed, it's claimed that he was quote unquote debriefed by the British intelligence services, who then attempted to recruit him to MI5, and he refused this offer, or so we're told. He then left his job at Harwell and moved to London, and it's there he eventually became a full-time freelance photographer. Get this, he was a nuclear physicist, right? Who went to Russia, came back, got debriefed by MI5, got offered a job at MI5, left his government job, and then went to London and eventually became a freelance photographer, working for a number of mainstream newspapers and also the UK music magazine, The Melody Maker, taking photos of, to name a few, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And here's the pictures of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Now, what he claims happened was, back after he graduated from Cambridge, so this was before he got his job at Harwell, but he was given a present, a gift, a graduation gift by his godfather, and this gift was a camera, and now Hoppy has claimed that he had absolutely no idea how to use a camera. Not in an effective way. He could take pictures, but he wasn't particularly proficient. He wasn't a proficient photographer. But he claims that when he got this camera from this gift, this graduation gift from this godfather of his, that he began to take up photography as a hobby, began to teach himself photography, and he then claims that he sent some photographs to a local newspaper, and this was whilst he was working at Harwell. He sent some photographs to a local newspaper that then used those photographs. So spurred on by this is what he claims, after he was effectively pushed out of Harwell, after being debriefed by MI5 for going to Russia, basically he decided, spurred on by this local newspaper being interested in his photographs, he was spurred on by this to go to London, right? This is what he did. He left this job at Harwell, where he was a nuclear physicist, decided that he wanted to become a professional photographer, moved to London, became a trainee photographer, then eventually a freelance photographer, and then managed to get himself work within the mainstream media, within the mainstream newspapers and magazines of Great Britain. And yeah, as I say, he ended up taking pictures of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, William Burroughs, Martin Luther King, as well as various CND marches. And he also got to take a picture of Bertrand Russell, and this is that picture. And as I say, he also took pictures of various music stars, including the Beatles, also the Rolling Stones. And yeah, so make of that what you will. Here we have a Cambridge University educated son of a naval engineer, right, who then becomes a nuclear physicist, then gets offered a job by MI5, then becomes a photographer taking photos of the biggest names of the 1960s, such as the Beatles and the Stones, before then going on to lead the so-called anti-establishment countercultural movement of Britain's capital. Yeah, as I say, make of that what you will. So, as I mentioned nearer at the beginning of this video, a few decades before Hoppy was seen to be the leader of the countercultural movement of 1960s London, there was another countercultural movement of sorts, and this was, of course, the Bloomsbury Group, who were friends and acquaintances of Bertrand Russell's. I'll just mention that here. In the early years of the 1900s, the Bloomsbury Group were championing. So historians inform us a life that rebelled against the restrained traditions and mores of their parents' generation. It was a life of sexual liberation, of personal freedom of expression, however shocking it might have been to the status quo. It was a group made up of intellectuals from well-to-do and illustrious backgrounds that included writers, book publishers and artists, and they were referred to as the Bloomsbury Group, perhaps because in the group's earliest years, starting around 1904, they would meet every week for drinks and conversation at number 46 Gordon Square in Bloomsbury. This is where one of the group's main members, author Virginia Woolf, lived for a time. Other Bloomsbury Group members included the artist Duncan Grant, fellow artist and art critic Roger Fry, novelist Ian Forster, and writer David Garnett, to name a few. And actually, if you look here, I'm in Gordon Square itself, the actual square, and number 46 Gordon Square, the house, is one of the houses that surrounds this square. And although number 46 is regarded as the initial meeting point of the Bloomsbury Group, the fact is there were other houses elsewhere. There were other houses surrounding that square where members of the group lived and met as well. There's number 51 Gordon Square. This is where the English writer and former Cambridge University student Lytton Strachey lived between 1909 and 1924. At number 50, meanwhile, sometime in the very early 1920s, so I understand, Virginia Woolf's sister Vanessa, a renowned painter, was living there before moving on to number 37 later in the same decade. Vanessa had initially lived with her sister Virginia at the previously mentioned number 46, and I'm heading now, if you look here, I'm in Gordon Square itself, the square. I'm within the square, and I'm walking towards the houses, and I'm walking towards number 46. It's just across the road from here where I'm walking towards it right now. And you can probably see that blue plaque there on the white wall. That's number 46. And there, if you read the plaque, you can see that actually it doesn't mention Virginia Woolf's name. Instead, there's the name of another Bloomsbury Group member, the British economist, many would say notorious economist, John Maynard Keynes. He lived at, as you can see it saying on the blue plaque there, on the commemorative blue plaque there, he lived at this address between 1916 to 1946, the year he died. But as I say, Virginia's name isn't mentioned on there. So there we have that. And I'll be mentioning John Maynard Keynes in just a little while. But before that, here you can see Gordon Square, the houses surrounding the actual gardens, if you like, which you can see here. Just walking across the road again towards the park, the square. There you can see the houses across the road again. And I think it's worth looking at some of the other houses along here. There is number 46. But I think it's worth looking at just one more house along Gordon Square, and that's number 50 Gordon Square, because there's a plaque there as well, which perhaps is worth looking at. Just making my way there now. along the road. We'll be there soon. Here it is. If you can see what it says there, it says here and in neighbouring houses during the first half of the 20th century there lived several members of the Bloomsbury Group, including Virginia Woolf, Clive Bell and the Straight Cheese. And I'm assuming when they say Straight Cheese, they're not only referring to the previously mentioned Lytton Straight Cheese, but also his brother as well, if I'm not mistaken. So there you go. That's another address here at Gordon Square, number 50. So there you go. Going to make our way now to Brunswick Square in Bloomsbury. This is somewhere else where John Maynard Keynes lived. He lived at number 38 Brunswick Square. So there we have Gordon Square. Taking a last look there before making our way now to Brunswick Square. So yeah, as I say, John Maynard Keynes lived at number 38 Brunswick Square in Bloomsbury, which is where we're heading to next. He lived there along with Virginia Woolf, also her husband Leonard Woolf, and the earlier mentioned Duncan Grant. So I leave Gordon Square. We leave Gordon Square, a location where Bloomsbury Group members lived and worked so close to each other and amongst each other, in fact, and head off, as I say, to Brunswick Square, another such location where members of the group lived so close to each other, very close to each other. There was this promiscuous, free-loving behaviour amongst the Bloomsbury Group, as some commentators say, a precursor, if you like, to the ethos of the sexually permissive 1960s, perhaps you might say yourself. If you recall earlier, for example, just to give you an example of some of this promiscuity within the Bloomsbury Group, if you recall earlier, I said that Virginia Woolf lived at number 46 Gordon Square. She moved in there in 1905. She lived there, as I mentioned earlier, with her sister Vanessa. Vanessa married fellow Bloomsbury Group member, the writer Clive Bell, in 1907. And following this, Virginia moved out, and Vanessa and Clive remained living there at that address until 1916. So Virginia moved out, but Vanessa and Clive remained there. They had 2 sons together before their marriage fell apart, and Vanessa then began a brief affair with the earlier mentioned Bloomsbury Group member Roger Fry, and then went into a relationship with another Bloomsbury Group member, the previously mentioned Duncan Grant, with whom she had a child with. And during all this time, she and Clive stayed married yet apart under a mutual understanding. Clive, so I understand, went on to have many mistresses. Also, I'm led to understand that Clive also lived at number 50 Gordon Square as well, and Duncan Grant lived at 37 Gordon Square with Vanessa. Duncan, as I mentioned just a couple of minutes or so ago, also lived at number 38 Brunswick Square in Bloomsbury with Virginia Woolf and her husband, Leonard Woolf, and John Maynard Keynes. And as I say, that's where we're heading to next on this walkabout. Born in 1883, John Maynard Keynes has been described as one of the most influential economists of the 20th century, if not the most influential. During the First World War, he worked at the Treasury, which is the UK government's economic and finance ministry, and did so again during the Second World War on the request of the UK's Chancellor of the Exchequer, in other words, the UK's finance minister. When the UK government sought a loan from the US government following the end of the war, following the end of the Second World War, Keynes actually led the British delegation to Washington to get this. It might interest you to know, if you didn't know already, that he's also regarded as a significant founding father of both the International Monetary Fund, in other words, the notorious IMF, and the equally notorious World Bank, which were both created in 1944, if I'm not mistaken. And yet again, we can find a link to Cambridge University here, because Keynes was closely tied to it, having not only been a student there, but later a lecturer of economics there as well. And it was through his time as a student at Cambridge that Keynes actually got introduced into the Bloomsbury Group. This was in the late 1890s into the early 1900s, when a large number of the Bloomsbury Group had actually been students there, including, as well as Keynes, Lytton Strachey, Leonard Woolf and Clive Bell. Keynes got married in 1925 to a Russian-born ballerina, Lydia Lobakova, but as you'll find if you look online or in books about him and his Bloomsbury friends, there's plenty of information focusing in on his sexual activities with men, such as, it said, with Daniel Macmillan, brother of then British Prime Minister-to-be Harold Macmillan. Daniel and Keynes were said to have been involved with each other whilst both students at Cambridge. Also, perhaps it's worth mentioning at this point that it was members of Harold Macmillan's government team in 1963 that became embroiled in what's been dubbed the Profumo affair, a headline-grabbing media sensation in 1963 that brought to light a then scandalous sexual affair between a so-called showgirl, Christine Keeler, a Soviet envoy, Yevgeny Ivanov, and Britain's Secretary of State for War, John Profumo. Given that this affair between the three was going on during the so-called Cold War between the so-called West and the Soviet Union, as a result of that, it called into question any potential risk of British government top-secret information falling into the hands of the Soviets, because here you have Christine Keeler involved in a two-way affair, if you like, with a Soviet envoy and a British member of the government, a Secretary of State for War. So yes, there was this question at the time in the British mainstream media that there was a risk here of secrets, government secrets, being leaked or passed over from the British to the Russians and so on. So this scandal, this headline-grabbing media sensation in 1963. It's called into question the credibility of the British government and the possible risk of British government top secret information falling into the hands of the Soviets. So this helped to bring down Macmillan's government, it said, paving the way in 1964 for a new political party, the Labour Party, headed by Harold Wilson. And what this affair also helped to pave the way for, so it's since been said, is the introduction of the sexually permissive 1960s, given that the lurid stories of sexual exploits between Keeler and her friends were being plastered across the British mainstream media to such an unprecedented scale during the height of the so-called Profumo affair, the reporting of it in the press, that it acted as a vanguard, if you like, as an opening of the floodgates, helping to bring about the birth of the so-called swinging 60s, especially given also that the Profumo affair broke big in the media at the same time as the Beatles were breaking through into mass consciousness in the UK, scoring their first ever number one hit in Britain with their third single, From Me to You. So you might say this was all much too perfect to be an accident. I'll leave that with you. Anyway, aside from Daniel Macmillan, Keynes has been quoted as listing in his own diaries sexual encounters with, to mention just a few, and I quote, a stable boy in Park Lane, London, a lift boy of Vauxhall, London, a Jew boy, and a 16-year-old. And with regards to the Bloomsbury Group's attitudes to sexual activity, including homosexuality, which in the early 1900s in England was still some 60 years away from no longer being an offence that could send you to prison. In her memoirs, Moments of Being, Virginia Woolf writes, and I quote, "So there was nothing that one could not say, nothing that one could not do at 46 Gordon Square. It was, I think, a great advance in civilization. It may be true that the loves of buggers are not, at least if one is of the other persuasion, of enthralling or paramount importance. But the fact that they can be mentioned openly leads to the fact that no one minds if they are practiced privately. Thus, many customs and beliefs were revised. Indeed, the future of Bloomsbury was to prove that many variations can be played on the theme of sex. It's been written that Keynes, within the Bloomsbury Group circle, had been sexually involved with Lytton Strachey, and also, incidentally, Lytton's brother James. It's claimed, however, that the great male love of Keynes's life was Duncan Grant. So we're told Keynes and fellow Bloomsbury Group member Duncan Grant were lovers. If you recall, I mentioned earlier that Grant had fathered a child with Virginia Woolf's sister Vanessa, who was still married at the time to Clive Bell. Duncan, it's claimed, was also involved sexually for a bit with Lytton Strachey, who is also his cousin. One writer I've come across has described these goings-on as Bloomsbury's, and I quote, Bloomsbury's sexual and homosexual merry-go-round. Indeed. And as I mentioned earlier, Virginia Woolf, after moving out of number 46 Gordon Square, went on to live at the location we're heading to next, Brunswick Square in Bloomsbury, and she lived there, as I said, with fellow Bloomsbury Group members Duncan Grant, Leonard Woolf, her husband, and Keynes, before he himself moved into Gordon Square, into number 46. Reflecting on number 46 Gordon Square and 38 Brunswick Square, the house the group shared there, author Matthew Ingleby, in his book Bloomsbury, Beyond the Establishment, writes, "These two Bloomsbury households loved in triangles and lived in each other's pockets. A whole host of other Bloomsbury addresses continued to participate in this important revision of culture, an intervention that helped change attitudes towards not only homosexuality, but also heterosociality, mutual non-sexual friendship between men and women. Keynes, co-founder of the IMF and the World Bank, key member of the Bloomsbury Group, as well as a one-time director of the Bank of England, in other words, he was director of England's central bank, was also for a time, so I'm led to understand, a director of the British Eugenics Society." There's very little information actually available online about his support of eugenics, and what I mean by that is there's very little in the way of verifiable documentation on the internet that you can easily find in order to take a closer look. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, of course. It's instead to be found in books and other forms of physical records, in speeches Keynes made about the subject and in his writings. There is a tiny amount of verifiable info online. His support of eugenics is no conspiracy theory. For example, there's info about it on the website charleston.org UK. This is the official website charting the history of an English country house by the name of Charleston. This is the house that Bloomsbury Group members Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant began living in during the First World War. These lovers, Vanessa's extramarital lover, Duncan Grant, they lived in this house by the name of Charleston during the First World War, from 1916 to be exact. Shortly after moving out of 46 Gordon Square, in actual fact, another of Duncan's lovers, David Garnett, lived in the house too. And according to author and historian Frances Spalding in her book The Bloomsbury Group, Garnett and Grant were involved in a ménage à trois with Vanessa. So again, we have this merry-go-round, this aforementioned merry-go-round going on here. The house was also visited by others within the group, including Keynes. So yeah, if you go take a look at this site, you'll see that it mentions his support of eugenics. It's mentioned there at charleston.org.uk. And this was picked up on by the UK news source The Telegraph in an article in 2021. And here it is. The headline reads, "John Maynard Keynes was a supporter of racist eugenics. Visitors to Bloomsbury Group home to be told." The Charleston Trust says the darker side of the left-wing thinkers' beliefs need to be addressed. John Maynard Keynes has been labelled a supporter of racist eugenics, as the darker side of the Bloomsbury Group is re-examined at the Intellectual Sets Country Retreat. And quoting the article here, the left-wing thinker, who gave his name to a branch of economics favouring planned government spending, was part of the Bloomsbury Group of early 20th century artists and writers, including E.M. Forster and Virginia Woolf. They regularly met at Charleston Farmhouse in Sussex, the country home of Woolf's sister Vanessa Bell, which is now run by a trust dedicated to the group's legacy. Keynes will be presented by the trust as a believer in racist eugenic theories of human selective breeding. The Telegraph understands that new information provided on an app for visitors to Charleston states, although many of John Maynard Keynes' ideas and theories are still respected today, we need to address the darker side of his beliefs. He was an active supporter of eugenics, a racist, ableist and classicist theory that the genetic quality of the human race could be improved through selective breeding and sterilisation. He was particularly concerned with the growing populations of non-white people. As chairman of the Malthusian League for Family Planning, Keynes said that quality should be considered in relation to the breeding of future populations, and argued that racial wars or a global segregation could be supported in order to protect our standard of life from injury at the hands of more prolific races. Aside from this article in the Telegraph, if you want to explore this further yourself, there's a presentation on YouTube you can watch titled The Economic Eugenicism of John Maynard Keynes. It's co-hosted by Sean Hernandez MA and Dr. Phil Magnus. It picks out quotes attributed to Keynes with regards to his support of eugenics, such as this one, and I quote, "The time has already come when each country needs a considered national policy about what size of population, whether larger or smaller than at present or the same, is the most expedient. And having settled this policy, we must take steps to carry it into operation. This time may arrive a little later, when the community as a whole must pay attention to the innate quality as well as to the mere number of its future members." Hernandez and Magnus also highlight this ad here for the CBC, short for the Society and Clinic for Constructive Birth Control and Racial Progress, based on Tottenham Court Road in London. There, amongst the list of names you can see there, underlined in red, J.M. Keynes. Also just one above him there in the list of names, Julian Huxley, brother of Aldous Huxley, author of the book Doors of Perception, a book and indeed an author that huge influences on the 60s counterculture scene. For example, John Lennon was a fan of Aldous Huxley, and the band The Doors are said to have taken their name, the band name, The Doors, from his book, The Doors of Perception. And Aldous, who was in some respects a godfather of the 60s counterculture, even though he died in 1963, just a few short years before it kicked off, was also a friend of the Bloomsbury Group and was, same as Julian, a supporter of eugenics. With regards to Keynes and eugenics, there's more to read about that on the site Miseswire, which is a site connected to the Mises Institute, or otherwise known as the Ludwig von Mises Institute for Austrian Economics. Ludwig von Mises was a 20th century economist, and the institute was founded in 1982, 9 years after his death. On the site Miseswire, there's an article titled Keynes on Eugenics, Race and Population Control. And from that article, there's this, quoting here from that article, to Keynes's mind, and then the article then goes on to quote Keynes, to Keynes's mind, there would be more happiness in the world if the population of it were to be diminished. Thus, the article then goes on to say, thus, Keynes advocated government violence to restrict the size of the population. He wanted government to, and again quoting Keynes here, he wanted government to mould law and custom deliberately to bring about that density of population which there ought to be. Keynes was especially concerned about overpopulation in the East. Again, quoting Keynes here, India, Egypt and China are gravely overpopulated. He's quoted as saying he thought his race was facing a race struggle. he advocated the use of imperialistic government violence against Eastern races to protect the white population. Quoting Keynes here again in this article, almost any measures seem to me to be justified in order to protect our standard of life from injury at the hands of more prolific races. Some definite parcelling out of the world may well become necessary, and I suppose that this may not improbably provoke racial wars. At any rate, such wars will be about a substantial issue. Elsewhere, Keynes is quoted as saying in 1927, "I believe that for the future the problem of population will emerge in the much greater problem of hereditary and eugenics. Quality must become the preoccupation." So, yeah, here we are, very close indeed to Brunswick Square. In fact, we're at Brunswick Square, quite literally. There across the road, you can see the street sign indicating that we're here. We're at our destination, Brunswick Square. There you go. So we're going to head towards the actual square itself. Just like Gordon Square, there's a garden square surrounded by houses. But unlike Gordon Square, I might be wrong about this, but looking around me here, and if you might be able to catch a hint of it yourself, unlike Gordon Square, there's not so many houses surrounding this particular square. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, number 38 Brunswick Square, the house where all these Bloomsbury Group members lived, no longer exists. It's not there. Otherwise, I'm not too sure what the state of affairs is there. It's either been knocked down or it's been renovated and turned into something else completely different. But it doesn't seem to be there anymore. Number 38, the actual house itself where they lived. It doesn't. I couldn't actually find it. It didn't look too obvious to me. So here we are going into the actual square itself, into the garden square, and there's a sign here which gives you a guide as to some of the people that lived at within this area. There you see, welcome to Brunswick Square Gardens, famous residence, it states, and there you have Virginia Woolf there on the photograph of her there on the extreme left, and next to her Duncan Grant. And next to him, James Matthew Barrie, J.M. Barrie, the playwright, novelist, and of course the creator of Peter Pan. He lived at number 8 Grenville Street, which is just a few, it's just less than a minute's walk, maybe about a minute's walk from where this sign is situated. Next to him there, a photograph of E.M. Forster, and below him there, the picture below him there, John Maynard Keynes. So there you go. There you go. Some of the sign there of some of the famous residents, as it states itself there, of Brunswick Square. Right. Well, from Brunswick Square, we're going to leave Brunswick Square now, and we're going to head to our next stop, which is Bertrand Russell's flat. Yes, we're going to go back on ourselves. We're going to return to Bertrand Russell's flat near Montague Street. In the meantime, with regards to Leonard Woolf, Virginia's husband, he was a revered, respected member of the notorious Fabian Society, the previously mentioned Fabian Society. Formed in 1884, the Fabian Society is described, according to its official website, as Britain's oldest political think tank. Its aim, it said, is to bring about collectivism. And as you'll probably be aware, and as I think I mentioned before, when names of organisations are mentioned by researchers and journalists within the alternative arena as having had a hand in aiming to bring about a one world order, the Fabian Society is regularly up there. Indeed, this organisation that was an original founder of Britain's Labour Party in 1900 is, so states its website, an influence on, and I quote, political and public thinking. It has a big impact on political and policy debate. Its staff work with a wide network of leading politicians and policy experts to develop and promote new ideas and to influence the climate of political opinion. So with regards to the Fabian Society, the method by which it goes towards inflicting this influence, this quote-unquote influence, can be seen, say its critics, through the symbology of one of the logos it adopted on its formation back in the 1880s, that of a wolf in sheep's clothing. In other words, it's depicting deception. Another of its emblems has been of a tortoise. So a tortoise, as a result, here we have a slow-moving, patient creature, and with the motto, "When I strike hard." In other words, the Fabians will achieve their agenda, but will do it in such a slow, steady manner that we, its victims, won't notice it coming. In 1897, the Fabian Society was a key influence in the founding of yet another of those often mentioned notorious social engineering New World Order friendly institutions, namely the LSE, or its name in full, the London School of Economics, a university brought into being after a bequest of £200,000 was left by a Fabian to be used, according to the Society's official website, for quote-unquote, for propaganda and other purposes. Armed with these funds, a small group of its members, including the playwright and reported supporter of eugenics George Bernard Shaw, launched the LSE to, and I quote, according to it, to official sources, to provide proof positive of the collectivist ideal. And if you look here, you can see a commemorative stained glass window of the Fabian Society, and there on the right, the figure in green on the right is a depiction, that's the face there, of George Bernard Shaw, and in the middle there you can see the logo of the Fabian Society, the wolf in sheep's clothing, and the man on the right, on the left in red is fellow Fabian Sidney Webb. And if you can see in their hands, George Bernard Shaw and Sidney Webb are holding in their hands hammers, and there beneath them, underneath the logo of the Fabian Society, is a globe. It's the world. So basically what they're doing is they're hammering the world into shape. And if you can see that inscription above them in red, with the red background and the black writing, yes, it says, "Mould it nearer to the heart's desire." And in 2006, this stained glass window was put on display at the London School of Economics. And in this article on the LSE website from 2017, you can see the title there, rather you might think rather an ominous title, "Hammering Out a New World, the Fabian Window at LSE." In this article, underneath that, what you might think rather ominous title, you can see there a picture of none other than the notorious Tony Blair, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, unveiling the window, this commemorative stained glass window for display at the LSE back in 2006. I'm going to show you something else now. This is a house at number 29 Fitzroy Square in Fitzrovia. We're not actually going to go to this house on the street tour, but I'm going to show it to you. Fitzrovia, if I'm not too mistaken, now it's not really in Bloomsbury, but it's very much next to Bloomsbury. It's not at all far away from Bloomsbury. But the reason I'm showing you this is, if you see, there's a plaque there, that a black plaque. It states that George Bernard Shaw lived in this house from 1887 to 1898. And if you look beneath that plaque, you've got a commemorative, one of those commemorative blue plaques again. Someone else who lived at this house is Virginia Woolf. She lived at this house between 1907 to 1911. A little bit of a connection going on there. Now, in the late 1920s into the early 1930s, the London School of Economics got funding from yet another of these often accused agents for a new world order, none other than the Rockefeller family, or in other words, its Rockefeller Foundation. In fact, the LSE was described as being, quote unquote, Rockefeller's baby. The relationship between the two continues to this day, and there's other LSE participants worth noting here. One's very much relevant to this video. For example, one of two to mention, the earlier mentioned Peter Jenner. As I mentioned before, one of the key movers and shakers of London's underground scene of the 1960s. He was actually a teacher, a lecturer at the London School of Economics before jacking that in to become a music manager, most notably of, as I said earlier, the Syd Barrett era Pink Floyd, handling their career from their early days on the psychedelic club scene of London, when they were effectively the Pied Pipers of that scene. So, so as you do, 1 minute you're a lecturer in a college, and as you do, you jack that in, and lo and behold, you find yourself a manager, being a manager of a band that goes on to become internationally famous. As you do. It reminds me actually of what I was talking about earlier, what I mentioned much earlier in this video, and John Hoppy Hopkins. There he was, a nuclear physicist working for the government, who then walks away from that and ends up taking photographs for the mainstream press of the Beatles and the Stones and Bertrand Russell, amongst others, as you do, and then ends up becoming the de facto leader of London's underground scene, London's countercultural movement of the 1960s. Also, with regards to Peter Jenner, if you recall earlier, I said that he hailed from Cambridge University. Also, he's the grandson of a fairly prominent Labour MP by the name of Frank Wise. And Jenner is quoted as saying that he himself came from a very left-wing family, a middle-class group of people, as it were, children of the Bloomsbury set. We'd all gone to posh universities with grants for free. I was pro-CND, went on all the early Aldermaston marches, got into smoking dope at Cambridge. I'm not exactly sure what he means when he's quoted there as saying that he's a child of the Bloomsbury set. I don't know if he means that quite literally, if that's meant quite literally, as in he has some kind of biological connection to the Bloomsbury set, or whether he's just talking from the stance of someone who's saying that he's an ideological child of the Bloomsbury set. I'm not entirely sure about that. Also, with regards to the LSE, I said that there were a couple of examples to mention of people who came from the LSE, people worth mentioning. Also, with regards to LSE, there's Mick Jagger, who was a student there at the LSE shortly before finding fame, very shortly before finding fame and changing the face of popular culture as a Rolling Stone during the 1960s. The 1960s, a decade when Fabian Harold Wilson was Britain's Prime Minister. Indeed, some members of his government team and his closest aides were fellow Fabian participants, including the politicians Roy Jenkins, Anthony Crosland, Dennis Healy, and also Richard Crossman, who, according to the Fabian Society's official website, and I quote, would prove vital to developing the agenda of the Labour government in 1964. As I said earlier, it's in 1964 that Wilson's Labour government was voted in the UK, and Wilson remained as Prime Minister for the rest of the 60s, that decade of great cultural change amongst the young. And his fellow Fabian participants, Crosland, Healy and Jenkins, who all became cabinet ministers in Wilson's government team, became, to quote the Fabian Society, the intellectual engine that underpinned much of the Wilson government of that era. And of that team, of that so-called intellectual engine, three of them, Wilson, Crosland and Jenkins, had actually been chairman of the Fabian Society. Additionally, Dennis Healy was a founder member of the notorious Bilderberg Group. Another participant of the Fabians who was connected to the Wilson government team of the 1960s was social policy analyst Richard Titmuss, who was also a high-ranking member of the London School of Economics. And now, as I head back to Bertrand Russell's flat in London, this is a good time perhaps to mention that another high ranker within the London School of Economics was Bertrand Russell. In fact, he's credited with being one of its financial founders and was its governor between 1901 to 1906, before becoming one of its earliest lecturers. And also, same as fellow LSE founder George Bernard Shaw and the earlier mentioned John Maynard Keynes, Bertrand Russell's name has been linked to eugenics. And is it any wonder? Russell, the co-founder of the CND, the organisation that, as I mentioned before, is credited with helping to act as an early catalyst for what a few years later would become the so-called 60s counterculture hippie movement, wrote and spoke quite extensively on population control. In 1949, for example, he said, "I do not pretend that birth control is the only way in which population can be kept from increasing. There are others which one must suppose opponents of birth control would prefer. War has hitherto been disappointing in this respect, but perhaps bacteriological war may prove more effective. If a Black Death could be spread throughout the world once in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. The state of affairs might somewhat be unpleasant, but what of that? There are three ways of securing a society that shall be stable as regards population. The first is that of birth control. The second, that of infanticide or really destructive wars. And the third, that of general misery, except for a powerful minority. Bertrand Russell put forward the idea that another effective way of controlling population was through a one world government. He said, "So long as there is not a single world government, there will be competition for power among the different nations. And as increase of population brings the threat of famine, national power will become more and more obviously the only way of avoiding starvation. There will therefore be blocks in which the hungry nations band together against those that are well fed. These considerations prove that a scientific world society cannot be stable unless there is a world government." So I'm led to understand Bertrand Russell was, during his time as a visiting professor at the so-called elite Harvard University in the US in 1914, he was, so I'm led to understand, a tutor of the American-born poet T.S. Eliot, who, same as Russell, became friendly with the Bloomsbury Group. Indeed, Eliot's and Russell's paths did cross years later, years after they're said to have been at Harvard. They did cross years later in England, in Bloomsbury, when Russell sublet that flat in Bloomsbury that he'd been living in. He sublet it to Eliot, the flat that we have now returned to here. Okay, well, on this street tour, we're now going to head back in the direction we came from again, and we're going to go onto Montague Street again and past Montague Street and beyond until we get to Tavistock Square, Bloomsbury. So with regards to T.S. Eliot, T.S. Eliot was also, as were others within the Bloomsbury social circle, of course, a keen supporter of eugenics. To quote an article published by Harvard, the university where Eliot studied, and I quote, Eliot held repugnant views about race, endorsing racial segregation, opposing interracial marriage, and promoting with enthusiasm the eugenics movement. For example, Eliot was quoted as saying in 1909, I believe, for example, that the Irish should not intermarry with the Americans of English descent, that the Germans should not marry the Italians, that the Jews should not marry the French. Each race should maintain its own individuality. The experience of civilization shows that racial stocks are never mixed with profit, and that such unions do not bring forth the best and strongest children. In the case of the Negroes and the whites, the races should be kept apart in every respect. He's also quoted as saying, the increase of liberty for all classes seems to promote the rapid breeding of the defective, irresponsible and vicious. And Eliot advocated preventing the feeble-minded from reproducing their like. To put it bluntly, if we're to take notice of another Harvard University article on Eliot, and I quote, Eliot was an outspoken supporter of forced sterilisation of people declared to be feeble-minded, physically disabled, criminalistic or otherwise flawed. In 1907, the US state of Indiana had enacted the nation's first eugenic sterilisation law. 4 years later, Eliot declared that Indiana's law blazed the trail which all free states must follow if they would protect themselves from moral degeneracy. He also lent his considerable prestige to the campaign to build a global eugenics movement. He was a vice president of the First International Eugenics Congress, which met in London in 1912 to hear papers on quote-unquote racial suicide among Northern Europeans and similar topics. 2 years later, Eliot helped organise the first national conference on race betterment in Battle Creek in the US state of Michigan. Now, if you're wondering why I'm mentioning Eliot, well, there is a reason for me mentioning him on this video, aside from the fact, or so it's claimed, that Bertrand Russell introduced Eliot to Bloomsbury Group as Roger Fry and Virginia Woolf and Fabian husband Leonard, as well as Bloomsbury Group friend and supporter of eugenics, of course, Aldous Huxley. There is some relevance to T.S. Eliot on this video here. He and Bertrand Russell, part of that relevance is that he and Bertrand Russell were members of a covert CIA-funded and supported collective made up of writers, musicians, artists, intellectuals and political figures that was formed in 1950 under the name of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and that formed a branch in 1951 under the heading of the British Congress for Cultural Freedom. The aim of this was to promote modern art and the so-called avant-garde into the mainstream, such as in painting, literature and of course music. Other participants of this CIA-funded Congress for Cultural Freedom and its activities, and who I've mentioned to you earlier, included Richard Crossman, Anthony Crosland, Dennis Healy, and also, it said, another fellow colleague of theirs in the 1960s Harold Wilson government, namely Roy Jenkins. It's also claimed that a Fabian Society journal titled Venture received funding from the Congress. Now, I might be wrong, but according to my research so far, it would appear, that the so-called counterculture, the underground scene of 1960s London, was built on the foundation of the avant-garde and would never have been as prevalent as it was without it. Now, I have to say, I can't speak for the American countercultural scene of the 1960s, where the so-called Summer of Love took place there in LA, in San Francisco. I can't speak for that basically because I haven't looked as closely into the US scene as much as I have been doing with London. However, given that London's countercultural scene was frequented and indeed championed by members of the world's most famous and influential music group of them all, the Beatles, through their work on albums including Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, which has often been hailed, Sgt. Pepper has often been hailed as the soundtrack of 1967's Summer of Love. As a result, I would strongly suggest that what was going on within London's underground scene had a huge impact on their American counterparts, and as a result all of the underground scenes going on within the so-called Western world. Before I go a little more into the influential figures within London's underground scene of the 1960s who were championing the avant-garde, I'm going to rewind a few decades before that to the years just after the end of the Second World War. The formation by the CIA in 1950 during the so-called Cold War of the earlier mentioned Congress for Cultural Freedom, or CCF for short, although I must add here that CCF, when I mention CCF in this respect, this has no relation to the earlier mentioned CCF that I mentioned earlier. If you remember, the Combined Cadet Force that John Hoppy Hopkins was connected to, was a part of. So when I'm mentioning CCF here, it has no relation to the earlier mentioned CCF that Hoppy was connected to. But the formation by the CIA in 1950 of the CCF, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, was, so it said, part of a cultural Cold War, as it were, by the West, by the so-called West, against the Soviet Union, an attempt by the US through the CIA to show the world, indeed to propagandise to the world, that America, although a country with a much younger cultural history than Russia, was just as intellectually sophisticated as Russia, and not only that, but was also, as opposed to Stalin's communist Soviet Union in the 1950s, open to the newest, most radical and most free-thinking and independent forms of art that were available in the 1950s, such as within the avant-garde, including avant-garde music. You might not regard avant-garde music to be music as such, not in the traditional sense anyway. You might not be of that view. Avant-garde music has been described as atonal. Also, it doesn't have a verse chorus followed by a verse and chorus. Avant-garde music doesn't have to have a melody or a tune if it doesn't want to. An example of what's described as avant-garde music is the piece titled Imaginary Landscape No. 4 for 12 radios. Premiered in 1951, it was the brainchild of John Cage, an American-born musician who was very much one of the key figures of the avant-garde during the mid to late 20th century. Essentially, without going into too much detail here, what Imaginary Landscape No. 4 for 12 radios is a performance in which 12 performers, each standing or sitting next to a radio, turn the knobs of the radio and pick up whatever it is that turns up on the dial, whether it, whatever it might be, whether it's white noise, a snatch of speech, a burst of music, whatever. It's a random piece, as is much within the avant-garde. Then there's a piece by German avant-garde composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen called in German Helicopter Streichquartett, or in English Helicopter String Quartet, premiered in 1993. Basically what happened in 1993 when it was premiered was, four players in a string quartet, after being introduced to their audience, then each boarded their own helicopter which took to the skies. Meanwhile, each string player, while they're in their each in their own helicopter, played their instrument to a score that had been written for the performance. Now, each helicopter has been mic'd up to pick up not only the sound of the string instruments being played, but also there's a separate microphone. There's a separate microphone attached close to the rotor blades of the moving helicopters, with the volume of the rotor blades, with the volume of the mic attached to the rotor blades only being slightly lower in volume than the actual string instruments. So you've got the sound of the rotor blades being part of this musical piece. Meanwhile, back on the ground, this sound was being fed into a sound mixing desk and played to the audience in an auditorium. Something else that's definitely worth thinking about and considering is that a lot of avant-garde art, whether it's within the realms of painting, music or performance or poetry, can very often be not only surreal in nature, but also disjointed or disturbing. I mean, look at what's on offer at art galleries across the world under the heading of modern art. Of course, to many who work and live within the so-called professional art world, modern art is celebrated, it's hailed as abstract. But what's deemed abstract, of course, to those within that world, within the art world, is to many folk outside of that world, looking in. They might see it as being ineligible, confusing, jagged, unsettling to the senses. And then in avant-garde music, again, ditto. What's deemed by avant-gardists and what's deemed by them as within avant-garde music as it might be celebrated by them as being atonal, might be deemed to people outside of that world looking in, to their ears, actually as something better described as lacking in tune and melody, and again unsettling to the ears. Now all of this, you might say, maybe is the real and hidden reason why the CIA wanted to promote the avant-garde. Not to prove to Stalinist Russia that America could match Russia when it came to high culture, but actually to destabilise America's culture, to disturb America's human senses, especially in its impressionable youngsters in the 1960s. After all, given that avant-garde music in particular, as I mentioned earlier, is lacking in tune and melody, is to many ears disjointed. Perhaps as a result, the aim of the US and UK intel services through its promotion of avant-garde art and music in the 1950s and into the 60s was to destabilise people's senses in the US and the UK, as well as Western Europe. Maybe that's something to think about, to consider. So where does the 1960s counterculture of the UK and its support of the avant-garde possibly fit in to a nefarious bid for destabilisation through social engineering? Well, at this point it's perhaps worth mentioning what's called okay, I'm going to try and pronounce some German here. It's perhaps worth mentioning at this point what's called the International Ferienkurse für Neue Musik Darmstadt, or in English, the International Summer Courses for New Music Darmstadt, or IFNM for short, or even the Darmstadt School, based in the German city of Darmstadt and founded in 1946. It's a place where twice a year avant-garde musicians and composers meet to participate in lectures, debates, discussions and performances there. And most of the biggest names in the world of avant-garde music have met there since its inception, including John Cage and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, the previously mentioned John Cage and Stockhausen. Now, the thing is, it has been claimed that both the US military and US intelligence paid for its formation, paid for the Darmstadt School's formation, so that it could be used to help promote avant-garde music to the world. At least one researcher worth mentioning who's put forward this scenario is the researcher Frances Stoner Saunders in her book Who Paid the Piper. Now, one of the avant-garde composers who attended Darmstadt in those earlier years was none other than Theo Adorno, the man who, it's been alleged, as you may indeed be aware, the man who, it's been alleged, was part of a Tavistock Institute plot that used the Beatles as social engineering puppets to debase society in the 1960s. And as you may indeed be aware, Adorno's alleged role in this plot was that he was the secret writer of all those hit songs that have been credited as having been written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Now I've got to say, as it stands at the moment, as I'm recording this, that I'm not 100% convinced about this claim that the Beatles had their songs written by Adorno. Firstly, my reason for thinking this and feeling this, firstly, is because there's actually been no proof of any sort put forward. No physical proof, evidence put forward to shine some credible light on this. And secondly, it is worth mentioning and it is worth considering that in the 1960s, Adorno was a middle-aged man and his musical background was nowhere near the realms of pop. He was, in fact, very much from the world of the avant-garde, hence why he attended Darmstadt, the so-called summer courses at Darmstadt. So, with that in mind, okay, considering that, honestly, are we to believe, when we think about that, where this man's background is, this middle-aged man with this avant-garde background, are we honestly to believe that that this middle-aged composer came up with teenager-friendly songs like "I Want to Hold Your Hand," "She Loves You," and "Love Me Do"? I mean, really? No. I mean, look, consider this, right? Consider this, that no, actually, Adorno didn't write the Beatles songs, but was actually a background influence in their slow, steady move from the Beatles' lovable mop-top pop of the early 60s, when they were singing "I Want to Hold Your Hand" and "She Loves You" and "Love Me Do." So he was basically a background influence in their slow, steady move from that lovable mop-top pop of the early 60s towards their displays and into their displays of avant-gardism in 1966 and 67 through counterculture-friendly songs on the albums Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. There's a fellow attendee of Darmstadt, a composer by the name of Konrad Böhmer, who once stated in an interview that was conducted in German and later translated into English that with regards to avant-garde music and the founding of the IFNM at Darmstadt, that it was indeed the intelligence services, namely the CIA, that helped to found it. And he's quoted as saying that Adorno and John Cage and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen were all in that CIA mix together. To be more exact, according to Böhmer, Theo Adorno was a major influence within the CIA when it came to pushing the avant-garde to the masses. To quote Böhmer, and I quote, "The Americans actually allowed themselves to be persuaded by Adorno that emancipated art would result in an emancipated society." With regards to the Beatles, you can hear elements of the avant-garde in the track "Tomorrow Never Knows" from their 1966 album Revolver. As you might indeed know, there are sound effects that permeate throughout this track, entirely made up of sound samples that have been cut up and looped and fed through effects units. I think it's maybe important to point out at this juncture that the track "Tomorrow Never Knows," with all its sound samples, back in 1966, in terms of popular music, in terms of pop music, this is perhaps one of the, if not the first, pop music tracks to feature such heavily laden sound samples. Now, when we listen to music these days, sampling in music is a given, but looking back to 1966, especially for those of us who weren't around at the time, who were more used to having grown up with listening to sound samples in popular music, there is this tendency perhaps that we take for granted the fact that pre-1966, pre-Tomorrow Never Knows, there wasn't really any popular music around at that time that was heavily laden and reliant on sound samples. So the Beatles, with the release of Tomorrow Never Knows, pioneered and were the forerunners of what now is termed to be just so regular within music. Sound samples, tape loops of sound samples, as I say, fed through effects units and in a random way. Very avant-garde, and Tomorrow Never Knows has been compared by the Beatles themselves to Stockhausen. And whilst mentioning Stockhausen here is a photo actually of Stockhausen and Adorno. This is said to have been taken at Darmstadt. And speaking of Stockhausen, he's one of the many faces that appears on the front cover of Faces on 1967's Sgt. Pepper album cover. 1967 also saw the release of the Beatles track I Am the Walrus, which at the end of it features a brief excerpt of a live BBC radio broadcast of Shakespeare's King Lear. Now, Barry Miles, if you recall, Barry Miles, the guy who I talked about earlier, one of the founders of the Indica Bookshop and Gallery, he said that John Lennon was spurred on to add this radio excerpt to the track after McCartney had told him about John Cage's compositions that featured random radio tunings. The King Lear sequence at the end of I Am the Walrus is John doing just that, randomly tuning the radio over the end of the song. Okay, so now then, consider this. Now, given that back in the 1960s, the Beatles were the most famous and best-selling music entertainers on the planet, and I'd suggest the most influential within their generation as well, then what better candidates could an organisation such as the CIA choose to sell such a fringe left-field art form as the avant-garde to a mass mainstream population across the world? Remember also that the Beatles were not only mega famous and mega influential and highly commercial, but also at the same time possessed with a large amount of street cred amongst their audience. So they weren't just hugely popular with teeny boppers, if you like, with teenage girl fans, but also with older people, college students, university students, if you like. Now, away from the commercial mainstream viability that the Beatles commanded, away and deep within the live venues of London's underground scene of the 60s, there was the avant-garde band AMM, championed by previously mentioned Pink Floyd manager and former LSE lecturer and Cambridge University student Peter Jenner, who's been dubbed an avant-garde music nut. Jenner got them to record an album in 1966 titled AMM Music, and the production credits of which are, so I'm led to understand, if I'm not mistaken, shared between Jenner and also former Cambridge University student and London underground scene's de facto leader, John Hoppy Hopkins. Additionally, one of the members of AMM, and who's said to have known Hopkins from earlier years too, was Cornelius Cardew, who was, would you believe, was also someone else who attended the notorious Darmstadt meetings and who's said to have been a protege of Stockhausen's as well, and to have worked with John Cage too. Syd Barrett from Pink Floyd. Syd Barrett is said to have been hugely influenced by the guitarist in AMM, Keith Rowe, and Paul McCartney attended a performance of experimental music by AMM in London in late 1966, and in true avant-garde fashion at that performance the audience was invited to participate by making sounds, which McCartney did by tapping his mug of beer with a pencil, and scraping a coin across a radiator grill. And joining him at the performance, at this AMM performance in London in late 1966, was his friend, the earlier mentioned Barry Miles. Indeed, when the Beatles' journey into avant-garde experimentation began sometime around 1965, it was through Barry, in the main, that McCartney got introduced into the world of the avant-garde, and that's notwithstanding, of course, Theo Adorno, who might have had a background influence in that move of Paul's towards the avant-garde too. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, Barry, back in 1965, worked at the Indica, which was a centre point in London for the counter-culture crowd, especially those looking to purchase avant-garde books, music, poetry and art. And McCartney's not only he not only supported it financially, the Indica, but he even helped to paint the shop ahead of its grand opening in 1965. Now, there were actually two Indica bookshops. What I mean is, it began in one location within London and then moved to another location not that long later. When it first opened in 1965, it was based in southwest London at the address number 6 Mason's Yard. What's in a name, eh? But yeah, as I say, the bookshop didn't last long at that address. Some 6 months later, Barry moved to bigger premises. He created a bigger Indica bookshop with another address that might interest you, 102 Southampton Row in Bloomsbury. And to give you an idea where it is, or where it was, because the Indica bookshop doesn't exist anymore, but it's the location is about 5 minutes walk from where Bertrand Russell's flat was in Bloomsbury. If you recall, we've been there a couple of times in this street tour. Well, if you remember where that flat is, where Bertrand Russell lived in Bloomsbury, yeah, it's about 5 minutes walk from there to Southampton Row. And here is the Indica, Southampton Row, as it was back in the 60s. And here it is now, or as I'm recording this is what it looks like. Also, something worth noting here, in the basement of the Indica bookshop here at Southampton Row in Bloomsbury, what you can see now, the location, what you can see now, the underground newspaper that I mentioned earlier that was launched by John Hoppy Hopkins, International Times, that was actually based downstairs in the Indica in the basement there at Southampton Row in Bloomsbury. And the proprietorship of the Indica, as I've mentioned before in this video, I'll mention it again though, the proprietorship of the Indica was a three-way business split between Barry and Peter Asher, whose sister, English actress Jane Asher, was of course dating McCartney at the time. And indeed, it's through McCartney's relationship with Jane and Peter that he got to meet Barry Miles. So this three-way partnership was between Barry Miles, Peter Asher, and also John Dunbar, who at the time of the Indica's opening was married to Marianne Faithfull, who not long later began a long-term relationship with ex-LSE student Mick Jagger. Additionally, Dunbar was yet another ex-student of Cambridge University, and his father, film producer Robert Dunbar, had worked during the Second World War for the British government's Foreign Office as deputy head of the Inter-Allied Information Office in Mexico and the Caribbean. And in 1944, he became head of press, public and cultural relations at the British Embassy in Moscow, and remained there for a total of 4 years. Indeed, when John Dunbar was born, he lived in Moscow for a time when his father was based there. So if we look at that, if we look at Dunbar's time there during the war, what he was up to, being involved with the Inter-Allied Information Office in Mexico and the Caribbean, and the British Embassy in Moscow, being head of press, public and cultural relations there, what we can take from that essentially is that, from my understanding, he was involved basically in organising wartime propaganda. And I'll get into more of that later in this video, because it does have relevance to the Bloomsbury area of London. But in the meantime, moving on to Peter Asher, Barry's and John's Indica partner, Peter Asher. What of him? Well, this brings us on to T.S. Eliot, Bertrand Russell's friend, and, if you recall me mentioning earlier, a fellow member of the notorious Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CCF. T.S. Eliot is bloodline related to the Asher family. A member of the CCF is related to the Ashers, according to none other than Jane Asher. She said the T.S. Eliot connection comes from her mother Margaret's side of the family. Furthermore, according to Paul McCartney's officially sanctioned biography from the 1990s, Many Years From Now, which was written by none other than Barry Miles, Margaret's father was, and I quote, Margaret Asher's father was, and I quote, the Honourable Edward Granville Eliot, brother of the 7th and 8th Earls of St. Germans of Port Eliot, St. Germans in Cornwall, an ancient Cornish lineage with the red hair of the fighting Celt. Bertrand Russell, T.S. Eliot's friend, has a very interesting family history too. Hence, one of the reasons that he gets mentioned in this video quite a bit. His surname Russell, if you remember earlier, much earlier on in this video, I mentioned that the flat he lived at, Russell Chambers. I did put forward the suggestion, the question, if you like, whether that name had any relevance, the building had any relevance to Bertrand Russell himself, and I did put forward the possibility that I was kind of 99% certain that there probably is some kind of relation, direct relation to Bertrand Russell, as to why that building is called Russell Chambers, where he lived at, and that flat he lived at, if you remember that. If you look at Bertrand Russell's surname Russell, it's directly related, to the Russell bloodline of the Duke of Bedford. And the Duke of Bedford family name got ownership of Bloomsbury, back in 1669, when William Lord Russell, son and heir to 5th Earl of Bedford, married the daughter of 4th Earl of Southampton, Lady Rachel Vaughan. So yes, Bertrand Russell's family owned and continues to own parts of Bloomsbury. Now, the Russells' roots can be traced back to an English town in the county of Devon. And what happened was, so I'm led to understand, back in the 16th century, when King Henry VIII transferred ownership of properties and riches that were once in the hands of the Catholic monasteries, when he handed those over to the new owners during the so-called dissolution, one of those to benefit in that dissolution was one of his royal courtiers by the name of John Russell, who became the first Earl of Bedford. He took over ownership of most of that town in Devon, that town which is actually called Tavistock. And for over 900 years, the bloodline of the Duke of Bedford dominated that Devon town of Tavistock, and its influence of this Devon town can be seen in some of the names in Bloomsbury, of course, such as in Tavistock Square, which is where we're heading to next on this street tour, of course. Tavistock Square is where the Tavistock Clinic once stood. In fact, it's where the Tavistock Clinic began. This was back in 1920. From the Tavistock Clinic later came the Tavistock Institute, its offshoot, both named directly after the Duke of Bedford's roots in that town of Tavistock in Devon. Well, that's what I'm guessing. After all, the property that the first site of the Tavistock Clinic was built on, as I say, back in 1920 in Bloomsbury, was a donation from the 11th Duke of Bedford. So the site of the Tavistock Clinic, the clinic from which later came the Tavistock Institute, was a donation from the family of Bertrand Russell, founder of CND, a catalyst, so it's been mentioned in this video a number of times, a catalyst of the 1960s London countercultural movement. So we're told the Tavistock Clinic was founded, according to official accounts, the Tavistock Clinic was founded as a result of what had gone on in the trenches during World War I, when soldiers were left psychologically damaged by the horrors they were experiencing. Today, this might be termed, this form of psychological damage might be termed as post-traumatic stress disorder. At the time, back in the First World War, a name that was used to describe this psychological form of damage from the horrors of the First World War, it was a condition that stirred the interest of doctors serving in the army at the time, and they described it as shell shock. And one such serving doctor was physician and psychiatrist Hugh Crichton Miller. And in December 1919, just over a year after the end of World War I, he publicly announced that he was seeking to open a clinic, an experimental clinic, according to a biography about the Tavistock Clinic, according to a biography that you can find on one of Tavistock Clinic's own websites, actually. And according to the official version of events, this experimental clinic would be the plan for it, before it opened, the plan for it was, Hugh Crichton Miller's plan was for it to be open to treat civilians based on what doctors had learned from the traumas they'd witnessed and treated, treatments that they'd used on soldiers during the First World War in the trenches. Some months after this meeting in December 1919, to discuss the ideas towards building this proposed experimental clinic. Some months after this meeting in 1919, in 1920, with the help of Bertrand Russell's family, the Tavistock Clinic opened at number 51 Tavistock Square, Bloomsbury, and I'll show you the site of that clinic later on in this tour. So, okay, I'd like you to consider this now. I'm going to show you something from the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations official website. Something to consider here, that if we're to believe the official version of history according to the Tavistock Clinic, if we're to believe that, well, what a transformation. We have the Tavistock Clinic, according to the official version of events, founded in order to help psychologically damaged people. Inspired by what had gone on in the First World War, it was built to assist people with mental health issues. Okay, so if we're to believe that, we've got we've got this clinic that was formed to help people with mental health problems, that along the line then moves into everything, just about every aspect of human society, every aspect of life, and yeah, it's gone from something where it's just there to help with people's mental health into everything, into influencing everything in British life. So with that in mind, this is what the Tavistock Institute's actual website states. And I quote, "In our earliest history," and incidentally, this piece I'm going to read to you now from their website was posted there to mark the centenary of the formation of the Tavistock Clinic in 1920. So, and I quote, "In our earliest history, just over a centenary ago, a group of medical professionals who called themselves the Tavistock Group worked with the British Army to help soldiers who had been prisoners during World War I return to civilian life, and, equally as importantly, to help their families and communities adjust to having them back. From returning soldiers to rapid changes in business management, workplace demographics, and the adoption or rejection of new technologies throughout the 20th century to the global social challenges of the 21st century, we pour ourselves into organisations needing change, individuals needing change, systems needing change. And sometimes the change needed is to accept change isn't needed. What arises from the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations isn't abstract. It's applicable study making a difference in all of our lives. And additionally, here's a quote on another Tavistock website. It's a quote from a former Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams. He states, and I quote, "The impact of the Tavistock on our social assumptions, its impacts on education, business, the understanding of the family, the life of the arts, and of course therapy," and of course therapy, as a sideline there, and of course therapy, demonstrates beyond any doubt that it has genuinely been a culturally defining presence. So, if we're to believe the official history, Tavistock began operation in 1920 initially to assist mentally disturbed soldiers of World War I. However, whatever the truth of that, since then, as you can see, just from those statements there, it's branched out and connected its tentacles into just about every aspect of society, including, as the Archbishop, or the former Archbishop of Canterbury says there, the arts. Some years prior to founding the Tavistock Clinic, the earlier mentioned Hugh Crichton Miller had authored the book Hypnotism and Disease, in which he charts the history of hypnosis, as well as advocating the use of it in treating patients. Another doctor who was an advocate of hypnosis, and indeed used it in his treatments, was Dr. Richard Asher, father of the previously mentioned co-proprietor of the Indica, Peter Asher, and of course his sister Jane Asher. Dr. Richard Asher was a leading physician who for a time was a consultant physician at the mental observation ward at the Central Middlesex Hospital in London. And in the 1950s he authored a paper titled Respectable Hypnosis, and in which he informs us that, and I quote, "I have used hypnosis as an ancillary method of treatment in general medicine. I have devoted one outpatient session a week to it. From this experience, I am learning a little about its use and limitations." Now, there have been anonymous accusations directed against the doctor, against Dr. Richard Asher in recent years, accusations linking him to MK Ultra type experiments allegedly carried out alongside widely reported Tavistock Clinic psychiatrist Emmanuel Miller and fellow psychiatrist William Sargent. A notorious figure, irrespective of this anonymous allegation. His name has been linked to the CIA's MK Ultra mind control program in mainstream reports, as well as alternative media reports as well. Although to date, no absolute solid proof, it has to be said, has come to light to confirm these. Anyway, as I say, there have been accusations made about Sargent and Emmanuel Miller and Asher, and that was supplied. These accusations were supplied to the proprietor of the thoroughly recommended website Beatles Conspiracy, which is run by Redwell Trabant. And here's just an excerpt of those allegations by the unnamed source, and I quote, "Asher, Miller, Sargent, all three were top psychiatrists. I worked with them all. I began helping med professors train nurses, doctors at 12 years old. There were many kids, not just me, but I only met two others. They decided I was suitable and flexible and asked me to help with research, some illegal stuff, but they needed to explore even these areas. Basically, they were into learning how the brain worked, but they were into other things too. Most of the time, I didn't know what they were getting up to. It was all mixed up and above my head, but they fed me well. They got into drugs as they knew it was becoming a problem. The police wanted to train cops to deal with it, how to work out what drugs they were on, etc. They supplied the drugs and were observing the tests most of the time. Sargent was different from the others. He was an outsider. The others didn't let him in on all they were up to, but they needed his input at times. They never spoke of it to me, but all did work for the government at times. What I do know is it's not necessary to hurt or drug people to brainwash them. Sargent had to, as he wasn't blessed with the psychic abilities Asher and Miller possessed. All were able to read minds, telepathy, deep hypnosis. No kidding, mate, for they were using this on me to get deep into my mind to understand how it all worked. Strangely, they all could do it, but nobody knew how it worked. It was passed down by word of mouth over the centuries to those who exhibited a talent for it. Sargent wasn't so blessed. He could do hypnosis, but only level 1, the one we all know about. As I say, Emmanuel Miller was, it's reported, as I mentioned, a Tavistock Clinic psychiatrist and and yes, a member of the Eugenic Society. His son was Jonathan Miller, someone you may very well be aware of. Jonathan Miller, stage director, author. That's who he was. Jonathan Miller, a stage director, author, and also co-member of the 1960s satirical comedy review group Beyond the Fringe, which it's often said and written was revolutionary back in the 1960s, back in the early 1960s. Revolutionary not only in British comedy, but in the culture of 1960s Britain and beyond, given that it's satire, that the satire that it used was directed towards politicians, religion, and the British royal family. And here are this is Beyond the Fringe, the comedy review group. There on the extreme left there is Alan Bennett. Next to him is Peter Cook, and next to Peter Cook there is Dudley Moore, and there on the right is Jonathan Miller, son of Emmanuel Miller. I thought I'd just show you this photo too, because with the black and white background, it's a little bit Masonic, that. So I just thought I'd show you that. Might interest you. Now, so I'm led to understand. Now, I wasn't around in the 1960s, so I don't know myself. I can't speak from direct experience. But from what I've been led to understand by historians and commentators who were actually there at the time, so I'm led to understand this satire that Beyond the Fringe pioneered. This, in other words, this lack of deference towards the so-called British establishment was virtually unheard of or ever seen before by the mass population. And it's said that it actually helped to bring down this brutal form of satire. It said it helped to bring down Harold Macmillan's government of the early 1960s that I mentioned earlier, and in effect, as a result, paving the way for the government in waiting in 1964, led by Harold Wilson and his team of Fabians and CCF members. I'm mentioning Jonathan Miller here because before he decided to throw himself completely into a career on the stage and in the arts of one shape or form, including his time in Beyond the Fringe, he was a fully qualified doctor who'd studied for a time under Dr. Richard Asher. Yep, Dr. Richard Asher, husband of Margaret, relation Margaret Asher, of course, relation of CCF member T.S. Eliot. Additionally, Margaret was a music teacher, and she taught at London's prestigious Guildhall School of Music, which is where a musician by the name of Dudley Moore studied. Beyond the Fringe member Dudley Moore. Moore was an Oxford University student, and who, along with fellow Oxford student Alan Bennett, and Cambridge University students Jonathan Miller and Peter Cook, of course, formed that Beyond the Fringe group. Also, with regards to Margaret Asher, she'd given oboe lessons to a one George Martin, the very George Martin who then, years later, would become record producer of the Beatles. Of course, the Beatles, of course, featuring in its lineup the guy who would become Margaret's daughter's boyfriend, Paul McCartney, who then went on to financially back that girlfriend's brother's avant-garde supporting bookshop and art gallery, the Indica. Small world? Yeah, well. Now, in December 1966, BBC Television screened an adaptation of the 19th century story by Arthur Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, and it was directed by Jonathan Miller. And I personally find it rather interesting that this old tale should have been screened at the end of 1966, a time when the hallucinogenic drug LSD was coming out of the shadows of MK Ultra and British intelligence and military, where it had been secretly used since at least the 1950s as a mind control drug, and became increasingly more known to the mainstream public. Because, again, I can't speak myself out of personal experience. Again, here I am reflecting on what historians and commentators have said who were there at the time, who themselves have reflected back to the 1960s. I'm referring to their reflections. I wasn't there, as I say, but according to what was going on at the time, up until around the middle of 1966, around the summer of 1966, effectively, the drug LSD was unknown to the mainstream public. It had been, in the most part, confined to this top secret world of military intelligence and governmental bodies with their secret experiments and projects. There were a few people outside of that top secret world, within the fringes of the so-called underground, within the fringes of the US and UK countercultural movements, who were using the drug. But in effect, in essence, the drug itself, aside from this top secret world and also the fringes of the counterculture, aside from that, basically LSD was unheard of to the mainstream public, and it was by no means a street drug. It wasn't a widely used street drug. But what happened around the middle of 1966, and what helped to push the drug and make it known to the mainstream, it has been said, is the involvement of the British mainstream media. Because around the middle of 1966, the British tabloid newspapers began running sensationalist stories. So, up until this point, when the British newspaper media the tabloid press were plastering all these headline-grabbing stories about LSD in the newspapers, up until this point, the British mainstream public, in the majority, were completely unaware of what LSD was. They'd never heard of it. And up until these headline-grabbing stories came along. So it could be argued that it would have remained that way, that the British public would have remained largely ignorant of LSD, and perhaps LSD wouldn't have become such a widely used street drug had the British mainstream media not plastered these stories in the press. So, if you're of a suspicious mind, you might, of course, conclude from that it was all deliberate, that this was part of the plan to basically to introduce LSD into society as part of this social engineering agenda during the 1960s to debase society, and especially the young of that decade. Also, at the same time that around the same time that these British tabloid newspaper stories were doing the rounds, in August 1966 came the release of the Beatles' Revolver and Tomorrow Never Knows, the lyrics of which are pertaining to the use of LSD. The lyrics were written by John Lennon, after being inspired by what he'd read in the book The Psychedelic Experience, a book which was co-authored by so-called US acid guru of the US counterculture, Timothy Leary, and of course alleged CIA agent as well, Timothy Leary. And it might interest you to know that Lennon had actually bought that book, The Psychedelic Experience, from which he got the inspiration for this song from. He bought the book actually from the Indica, so it said. Now, from what I understand, The Psychedelic Experience is basically a guidebook. It's a guidebook for people who haven't yet used LSD, and it's guiding the would-be user to use LSD through this guidebook, to take LSD and to go through the experience without being psychologically damaged, without having a bad trip, basically a bad experience whilst taking the drug. Now, if you remember earlier, I said that the Beatles, I've made references before as to the huge impact, the huge influence that the Beatles had. They were one of the most famous people in the world at the time. Their influence was massive. It's also worth noting that such was their influence that they didn't only influence teeny boppers, if you like, music fans, young music fans. Their fame, their audience appeal spread right across the spectrum. Okay, so we're talking from toddlers right the way through to teeny boppers, yeah. Teenagers, older teenagers, college students, mothers, fathers, uncles, aunties, right the way through to grandparents. So imagine that you have this hugely influential band like the Beatles, with this huge influence right across the age spectrum, singing a song such as Tomorrow Never Knows, with these lyrics pertaining to LSD at a time in August 1966 when the drug was largely unheard of. So December 1966, as I mentioned just a little while ago, December 1966 is when this BBC and Jonathan Miller adaptation of this hallucinogenic old tale, Alice in Wonderland, was released. December 1966, right at the end of this year, in the middle of which, as I said before, we had this push by the British mainstream media of this largely unheard of drug, LSD, and also this push, it could be argued, by the Beatles as well, through the avant-garde laden, let's not forget, song Tomorrow Never Knows. This push, it could be argued by them, of LSD through that song Tomorrow Never Knows. And right at the end of that year, as I say, in December 66, we have this hallucinogenic old tale, as I say, of Alice in Wonderland being released. It's quite interesting, actually. I find it quite interesting that it should have come out in December 66, not only because it came out at the end of this year when there'd been this push in the middle of 66, this push of LSD into the mass mainstream consciousness, but also December 1966 into 1967 was a time when there were music bands that were bubbling under the surface and ready to break through, such as, for example, US band Jefferson Airplane and the earlier mentioned Pink Floyd, as well as established groups such as the Beatles. This was a time when there were bands like that were recording and writing music at that time that tapped into the whimsy, the magic and the old worldness of Lewis Carroll. There was this kind of Lewis Carrollesque, kind of hallucinogenic, old world kind of vibe to a lot of music that was coming out at that time, December 66 into 67. Songs that tapped into that kind of vibe, into that kind of theme, songs with references to, for example, gnomes and pixies and assorted Victoriana. Certainly in Britain in 1967, if you look at like the psychedelic music scene, you can see kind of references to Victoriana and that kind of old worldness. You can see it in the Sgt. Pepper album, actually, just to name one example. Certainly in some of the themes that were within the debut album by Pink Floyd as well, Syd Barrett era Pink Floyd. So I find that interesting. I mean, if Jonathan Miller and the BBC were looking to tap into a societal and cultural zeitgeist, you might say they couldn't have timed it better. Yeah, I'll leave that there with you. One of the locations used for Jonathan Miller's adaptation of the story of Alice in Wonderland is worth mentioning, I think, especially because it's said to have connections to his father, Emmanuel, and Emmanuel's alleged co-conspirator as well, the notorious Dr. William Sargent. There's a sequence in the TV adaptation that's said to have been shot at what's been described as once having been the UK's largest military hospital in the UK, the Royal Victoria, also known as Netley, near the English city of Southampton. Built in the 1800s, it treated casualties from the Crimean War as well as World War I and II, and is thought to have possibly been the location for MK Ultra type tests with LSD on human guinea pigs during the 1950s. If not, it's claimed a place where at least recipients of acid-induced treatment were taken to after the actual experiments had been carried out at Porton Down Research Centre, which, as you may indeed know, is a UK government-controlled location that most certainly has conducted such tests with LSD during its history. And it's said Sargent worked there too, at Porton Down. Information linking Netley Hospital with governmental military mind-bending and altering acid experimentation is featured in the book Albion Dreaming, a popular history of LSD in Britain by Andy Roberts. In the book, Andy mentions a quote-unquote anecdote that, and I quote again, suggests that Netley Military Hospital in Southampton might have been used to treat those who didn't recover quickly from the effects of LSD after taking part in such experiments. He goes on in his book, Brigadier John McGee was Colonel Commander of Netley during the 50s and 60s. He would often take his nephew Robert Owen with him when he carried out his daily round of the wards. The young boy was shocked by the sights and sounds he witnessed, at first believing the sufferers to be mentally ill. His uncle told him these unfortunate soldiers were victims of chemical experiments such as LSD from both grenade canisters and artillery shells to see what effect they had on the human mind in a battle situation. It also seems probable that servicemen were being used as human guinea pigs in LSD experiments at Netley. In his book Albion Dreaming, Roberts then quotes who he describes as LSD psychotherapist Ronnie Sanderson, a former trainee at South London's Maudsley Hospital, where William Sargent was working for a time, incidentally. Ronnie Sanderson was a former trainee at South London's Maudsley Hospital and also at Tavistock Clinic, reportedly Emmanuel Miller's old stomping ground, of course. In Andy's book, Sanderson's reported to have said, I believe LSD was used at Netley, but I have no details of who was involved. It's reported that parts of Netley were damaged by fire and fell into disrepair in the early to mid-1960s and were closed. And apparently in Jonathan Miller's Alice in Wonderland, that BBC adaptation, we see the hospital in sequences where Alice runs to follow the White Rabbit. These sequences here. Some years earlier, to 1966, almost a decade earlier, a young Jane Asher played the role of Alice, would you believe it, in a stage version of the story and also in an audio presentation for vinyl LP. Do these connections stop? Well, no, not yet. Here's Jane as Alice in, you might say, MK Ultra-esque photo of her, with the mirrors there, the twinning, the mirror imaging. Now, William Sargent was a practitioner in sleep hypnosis, and with frightening effects, if we're to believe a number of his patients who've come forward to talk. Linked over the years to MI5, MI6, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, MK Ultra. Sargent, during the Second World War, worked at Sutton Emergency Hospital in the English county of Sussex, later renamed the Belmont Hospital, where he administered hypnosis as well as electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT for short, and also administered drugs on people suffering from, and this might remind you of roots of the Tavistock Clinic, shell shock. He then went on and dispensed these various techniques after the war on everyday non-military folk when he became head of psychiatry at St Thomas's Hospital in London. One of his patients there later talked of her harrowing experiences when she was there, claiming that following her treatment under Sargent, that included, to use her words, massive amounts of drugs in order to keep her asleep, she became, to use her words again, a walking zombie. She claims that the aim of all this was, so she claims that those at the hospital were saying around her at the time, was to repattern her thinking. That's the quote. That's a quote directly from her, to repattern her thinking. Actually, she claims her memory was virtually wiped. She couldn't remember her younger years when she was at school or later at the birth of her children. Someone else who was treated there and who had a background in nursing claims she was given a dose of ECT that left her at the end of it not knowing what her name was or who she was. She also recalls being given a drug that she recognised as a truth drug, although she can't quite recall if it was a drug that was called sodium pentothal or it could have been sodium amytal. Whatever, when Sargent retired from the hospital in the 1980s, it's claimed he took all of his records of the treatments with him and illegally destroyed them. Incidentally, a doctor that worked under him during the 1960s was Dr. David Owen, now Lord Owen, and who became a politician in the 1960s and served in government as Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State between 1968 to 1970 for Harold Wilson. Additionally, Owen is reportedly a Fabian. With regards to Sargent, again, in 1957 he authored the book Battle for the Mind, The Mechanics of Indoctrination, Brainwashing and Thought Control. And in it he documents various ways and means in which both animals and humans can and have had their behaviour changed to the will of controllers. I've got a copy of this book myself, and on the back cover here, in summarising the flavour of the book, it states, the objective of this remarkable book is twofold. One, to show how beliefs, whether good or bad, false or true, can be forcibly implanted in the human brain, the science of indoctrination. And two, to explain how people can be switched to arbitrary beliefs absolutely opposed to those previously held, the science of brainwashing. In detail, the author, William Sargent, describes the methods used to achieve these ends by politicians, priests, psychiatrists and police forces the world over. And so, yeah, this, as I say, this is the back cover of the book, my copy of it, as it was published in 1957. And if you notice at the bottom there's a couple of recommendations for it. One from Aldous Huxley, a Bloomsbury Group friend, of course, and there another one, yeah, there he is again, Bertrand Russell. And in Battle for the Mind, Sargent also mentions how the power of music can control the mind. He writes, and I quote, recordings of the human brain show that it is particularly sensitive to rhythmic stimulation by percussion and bright light, among other things, and certain rates of rhythm can build up recordable abnormalities of brain function and explosive states of tension, sufficient even to produce convulsive fits in predisposed subjects. Furthermore, it's easier to disorganise the normal function of the brain by attacking simultaneously with several strong rhythms played in different tempos. Bertrand Russell spoke of how music, and popular music at that, could be used on the mind to control behaviour. In 1950, just over a decade before the Beatles and the Rolling Stones found fame in Britain, of course, and around 16 years before the so-called counterculture of London was blossoming. and which was born partly, as I've mentioned before many times in this video, and which was born partly as a result of Russell's founding of CND, he said, and I quote, "Physiology and psychology afford fields for scientific technique which still await development. I think the subject which will be of most importance politically is mass psychology. What is essential in mass psychology is the art of persuasion." Now, what went wrong formerly was that people had read in books that man is a rational animal and framed their arguments on this hypothesis. We now know that limelight and a brass band do more to persuade than can be done by the most elegant train of syllogisms. It may be hoped that in time anybody will be able to persuade anybody of anything if it can catch the patient young and is provided by the state with money and equipment. This subject will make great strides when it is taken up by scientists under a scientific dictatorship. The social psychologists of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Various results will soon be arrived at. First, that the influence of the home is obstructive. Now, I'll just pause there. Remember what I said very much at the beginning of this video, that what critics have opined and indeed claimed is that the social engineering of the 1960s, this sexual permissiveness, the so-called underground movement, and was in part created, was social engineered in part in order to destroy family values. So here we have Bertrand Russell stating in 1950, and I quote, "Influence of the home is obstructive. Second, that not much can be done unless indoctrination begins before the age of 10. Third, that verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. Although this science will be diligently studied, it will be rigidly confined to the governing class. The populace will not be allowed to know how its convictions were generated. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for a generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen." So there you have it. And perhaps it's worth noting that this speech by Russell about using music to control was made, as I said earlier, in 1950, the year he joined the CCF, and of which he became an honorary chairman of in 1951, it's said. And so we're very much close to our next stop on this street tour. We're heading towards Tavistock Square and Tavistock Square Gardens. And Tavistock Square is, of course, where the Tavistock Clinic was founded, where it began in 1920. And it wasn't there for that much of a long spell. As I say, it was formed in 1920. Number 51 Tavistock Square was the address. So, here we are at Tavistock Square Gardens in Bloomsbury. And I'm heading back from the sign there to the address Tavistock Square. So I'm moving away now from the actual gardens, Tavistock Square Gardens, to Tavistock Square. It's at Tavistock Square, as I mentioned earlier, that Tavistock Clinic began operating in 1920 at number 51. And there's the road sign. We're literally now at Tavistock Square, on Tavistock Square, next to the gardens in the middle there. And as you see me here, taking these shots here on my phone at Tavistock Square, at the time when I was shooting this, I was actually looking for number 51, where the Tavistock Clinic was. And as you see this row of buildings here, these partly white painted buildings. I walked up and down these about 2 or 3 times, trying to find number 51, and I found just about every other number except for number 51, and I just began getting a little bit confused there, because I thought, what's going on? Was I not looking properly? Maybe number 51 doesn't exist anymore. So yeah, I just kept looking up and down that row of houses there, buildings there, and I in the end I just gave up. So yeah, this is me giving up basically and walking back towards Tavistock Square Gardens. Tavistock Square, of course, is where part of the 7/7 terrorist attacks took place in 2005. And given that there are many anomalies in the official story to that, you might say that one of the bombs going off in a part of London with the name Tavistock attached to it is one of those kind of occult messages for those with the eyes to see, of course. So here we are back at Tavistock Square Gardens, and I'm going to take you now towards a bust of Virginia Woolf, because Virginia and her husband Leonard lived at Tavistock Square, in actual fact, between 1924 and 1939, and there you are, there's a sign there with Virginia's photograph on it. Welcome to Tavistock Square Gardens. Yeah, they lived would you believe it, they lived at number 52. Right, yeah, that's right, number 52. The couple lived right next to where the Tavistock Clinic was first based in 1920. So Virginia and her Fabian husband lived at number 52, and yeah, the Tavistock Clinic, on its founding in 1920, was at number 51. And there's the bust of Virginia Woolf, 1882 to 1941. So yeah, fancy that. As I say, Virginia Woolf lived with a Fabian husband at number 52, and the Tavistock Clinic was right next door at number 51. So the Woolfs would have actually lived at number 52 for part of the time that the Tavistock Clinic was at number 51, because the Tavistock Clinic was at number 51 from its inception in 1920 right the way through to the end of the 1920s, when it moved after it became too small for purpose. As I say, Virginia and her husband lived at Tavistock Square number 52 between 1924 to 1939. And having returned from London and gone home to try and discover where number 51 was, I looked online, and apparently number 51 and number 52 do not exist. Not in the way that they used to exist. A hotel stands in their place now, and there it is, the Tavistock Hotel. This is the site where Leonard Woolf and Virginia Woolf lived, and next door to them is where this, yes, is the site where the Tavistock Clinic began. And what happened was, during World War II, in the Blitz in 1940, number 51 and 52 was bombed and turned into rubble. And there you have the plaque marking the place where Virginia and Leonard lived, number 52. number 52 Tavistock Square. And indeed, I've got an artist's impression here of what the Tavistock Square clinic looked like before it was bombed in 1940 during the Blitz, during World War II. And apparently this is the result of that bombing, what happened. Right, on the way to the next stop on this street tour, and on the subject of the Tavistock Clinic, the earlier mentioned lauded founder of it, Hugh Crichton Miller, this man who said, according to the official counts anyway, of having founded the Tavistock Clinic in order to help folk with mental health issues. He went on to form during World War II a collective of doctors known as the Invisible College, who, and this is according to information you can find on official Tavistock Clinic websites, who, and I quote from one of those sites, who worked on the interrogation of prisoners, propaganda for the enemy, as well as clinical support for the army. So, like I say, this guy, Houghton Crichton Miller, who formed a clinic for, we're told, to help the mentally vulnerable, during the Second World War was specialising in quote-unquote interrogation. Or should that be torture? Is that just another word for torture? Yeah, quite a jump in priorities there, isn't it? From supposedly caring for people's mental well-being to interrogation. At the end of the war, this so-called Invisible College played a role in the denazification of Germany. I think this is worth a mention, albeit very briefly, because denazification the denazification of Germany at the end of World War II does have some links to what would later result in the formation of the earlier mentioned Congress for Cultural Freedom, and also the notorious Darmstadt School. In a nutshell, I won't go into too much detail about this, but in a nutshell, basically what denazification was. Basically what happened was, at the end of the war in 1945, directly after the war, in the last dying days, the Allied forces moved into Germany, so this would have been Britain, the US, Russia, and various other countries, of course, within that Allied group. They moved into Germany, and each country took a share. I think each Allied country, certainly the UK and the US and Russia, took a share each to occupy in Germany. That's what happened directly after the war. What denazification was essentially what happened was the British and the US forces, once they moved into Germany, what they did was they shut down the radio stations, newspapers, theatres, they silenced the composers. And essentially what they were doing there, or according to the official history, what the point of this was, we're told, according to official sources, this quote-unquote denazification, what the whole point of this closing down of these media outlets and these outlets for entertainment, what the reason for it was essentially an effort in order to investigate each of these outlets, the newspapers, the theatres, the radio stations, the orchestras, was in order for the US and Britain to investigate these various outlets and to funnel out and to delete any possible Nazi influences that there might have been within these outlets. So, for example, if there was a theatre director working in one of the theatres in Germany that the British and the US were occupying in their portion of what they took over once they moved in with all these other countries, if they found a theatre director who they deemed was directing or supporting material in his plays in theatres that had a Nazi supporting theme to it, they would draw out this director and basically delete him from the scene. They would essentially censor him. They would move him away from working in the theatres anymore. So that's basically what it was. It was basically censorship. It was censoring any form of possible support towards the Nazi Party, towards Adolf Hitler, whether it came from newspapers or the radio or theatre, or quote unquote the arts. And indirectly, this was the root of what would in the 1950s be what I mentioned before, this cultural Cold War, this so-called cultural Cold War, which brought about the formation of the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the Darmstadt School. So yeah, that's why I'm mentioning this. It would appear that the Invisible College, well, it's a fact, according to the Tavistock Clinic's own websites, the Invisible College, Hugh Crichton Miller's Invisible College, had a role to play in this denazification of Germany. Unfortunately, I've tried to have a look into the background of the Invisible College and what exact role this Invisible College might have had in the denazification of Germany, but I haven't been able to find anything at all. All I've been able to find out is that, yes, the Invisible College did play a role in the denazification of Germany, but what that role was, I don't know. But on the subject of propaganda, actually, we're now heading to another address in Bloomsbury worth mentioning. We're heading to the location where the Senate House building is situated. These days it houses the University of London, but during the Second World War it was the location of the British government's Department for Propaganda, and George Orwell's wife worked there. To quote once again from a book I quoted from earlier, from Matthew Ingleby's book, Bloomsbury Beyond the Establishment. For the duration of the Second World War, the British government's Department for Propaganda, the Ministry of Information, was located in Senate House, the central building of the University of London. When George Orwell, whose wife Eileen worked in the ministry's censorship division in the early 1940s, included a version of this special branch of the civil service in his terrifying political fantasy 1984, he renamed it as the Ministry of Truth, or Mini-True. In Orwell's book, 1984, a huge pyramid-like building of white concrete towers over the city, containing thousands of offices dedicated to falsifying historical records and to disseminating an invented language called Newspeak. Orwell's fictional responses to the Ministry of Information conspicuously tweaked its name. In so doing, hinted at the ways in which the Bloomsbury office depicted was itself in the business of monitoring and manipulating words. And here is a shot of the Senate House. Here we are at the Senate House. Now the University of London. Yes, indeed, as Matthew Ingleby notes in his book, very much pyramid-like in its look. So we're now coming to the last stop on this street tour, and we haven't got very far to go, actually. Literally, we've got as far to go as just across the road from the Senate House, actually. Just a few yards away from it, across the road. Now, if you remember earlier, I mentioned Robert Dunbar, the film producer, father of one of the Indicate partners, John Dunbar. If you recall, I said Robert, during World War II, had worked for the British government's Foreign Office as deputy head of the Inter-Allied Information Office in Mexico and the Caribbean, and was also head of press, public and cultural relations at the British Embassy in Moscow. Well, before taking on any of those posts, guess where he worked? The Ministry of Information. So just one more stop on this street tour to go, and whilst we're heading there, actually on the subject of the Dunbars, Robert Dunbar's one-time daughter-in-law, John Dunbar's wife, in other words, his one-time wife, Marianne Faithfull. If you look into her background, you'll see some so-called elite family connections, and it's interesting that her one-time husband, John Dunbar, should have had a father, Robert Dunbar, who worked for the British government in the Department of Propaganda in the Foreign Office, because it's reported that Marianne's father, Robert Glyn Faithfull, was Major Robert Glyn Faithfull, a British spy. So here we are, heading towards that final destination on our street tour. We're just mere minutes away from the Senate House building that we've just been to. Literally just a mere short few minutes away from that Senate House building. Opposite that building, just across the road from there, our final destination. It's not an incredibly important destination to go to, but seeing as it is not that far from the Senate House, I just thought, well, why not? Why not stop here, seeing as we're so close? And it's another garden square we're heading to. This garden square is Russell Square Gardens. If you recall earlier in this video, I put forward the idea that one of the flats where Bertrand Russell lived, that we went to, that we had a look at in this video, one of the flats he lived at and sublet to T.S. Eliot, was possibly owned by his family, by the Russell bloodline, by the Duke of Bedford bloodline, given that the name of the building of the flat where he lived was called Russell Chambers. And here we are again, and I would hazard a guess that Russell Square Gardens is owned by the Russell bloodline, the Duke of Bedford bloodline. And another reason why I'm thinking that is quite possibly the case is because here we have a statue of one of the Dukes of Bedford. Now, I did try with my phone, with my video phone, to try and get a fuller picture, a more complete picture of this, a more complete image, if you like, of this statue. But there was too much stuff surrounding it, too much paraphernalia. I couldn't actually get a full view of it to show you. So what I've done instead is gone online and found a photograph of it. And here it is. This is a photograph of the statue of one of the Dukes of Bedford in that Russell Square Gardens spot. Francis, Duke of Bedford. There you go. Now, before I sign off this video presentation, somewhere else that I did go to and take some phone video footage of was the London School of Economics at just outside of the Bloomsbury area, just a few minutes outside of the Bloomsbury area of London, at the address Lincoln's Inn Fields, which is where you can find the new academic building, as it's called, of the London School of Economics. Yeah, I thought I'd take some footage of that, even though, you know, it's not actually in Bloomsbury. I thought, well, seeing as it's a few minutes outside of Bloomsbury, I thought to myself, well, why not take a walk and with my phone and take some footage of that. So that's what I did, and here it is. This is where the new academic building is of the London School of Economics. As I say, just a few minutes outside of Bloomsbury, just a few minutes walk. A rainy day in London, as you can see. And here's one of their window displays just here. Welcome to the LSE. Now, I did take some photographs as well of some of the other window displays. I didn't take any video footage of it, but I did take some photographs, and I thought they might be of interest to you. Here's one. LSE, meet the future, shape the world. Okay, that might not be clear enough for you to see, so I took another photograph of it there. There's still a bit of a reflection from the lights inside the building itself, but there you go. LSE, shape the world, meet the future. And there's another one here, shape the world, LSE. Make of that what you will. Well, thank you very much for watching and listening to this video. Thank you for taking the time to do that. I hope you found it educational, informative, interesting, and dare I say it, entertaining. And yes, indeed, if you'd like to find out more about what I get up to, I do have some websites you can go take a look at. I've got my website Conspiromedia, which is a site where there's a number of articles about, predominantly these days, a number of the articles that I publish in more recent times has to do, in actual fact, and you might not be surprised to learn, has to do with the 1960s so-called underground counterculture movement. And so that's Conspiromedia, which you can find at conspiromedia.wordpress.com. There's also my site, The Occult Beatles, which you can find at theoccultbeatles.wordpress.com. Then you have my Facebook page, Conspiromedia Facebook page, which basically is a compilation of what I put up on the Occult Beatles website and my Conspiromedia website, as well as extra stuff. So yeah, it's kind of like a compilation of the two websites, the Occult Beatles and Conspiromedia, and then some. And you can find that Facebook page at facebook.com/Conspiromedia/. So thank you once again for taking the time to listen and view this video presentation. Until the next time.